Hi friend, wherever you're listening right now, whether you're already in bed, on a late night drive, or just trying to unwind after a long day, welcome. If you enjoy calm history stories like this, I'd love it if you hit the like button and subscribed. What topic would you like me to tell you next? Somewhere in the world tonight, in a city that no longer carries the name it once did, there is an apartment building still standing. Its walls are the colour of old concrete, the colour of winter sky, the colour of something that was once cream and has since been washed pale by decades of rain and frost and the slow passage of time. The building is 7 stories tall. It has 48 identical windows, each exactly the same size, each framed by the same thin strip of metal that has rusted just slightly at the corners. The stairwell inside smells of damp stone and boiled cabbage and something sweet and indefinable. The ghost of a meal cooked 30 years ago, absorbed now permanently into the plaster of the walls. This building was not built to be beautiful. It was built to be enough. It was built quickly, in a year when the state decided that people needed roofs over their heads above all other considerations, and so roofs were provided, efficiently, uniformly, without sentiment. And yet, inside each of those 48 identical windows, a life was lived. Children were born and grew up and fell in love and argued and forgave each other. Old women kept window boxes of geraniums because the red of the flowers was the only red they could choose for themselves. Old men played chess in the stairwells on summer evenings because the stairwells were cool and the game required nothing that the state had not already permitted. Families ate their dinners at 6 o'clock because dinner was always at 6 o'clock. And somewhere below the table, a child pressed her foot against her brother's foot, and they held back laughter, and their parents pretended not to notice. And for those few minutes the apartment was not grey at all. It was warm and real, and entirely human. This is what we lose when we think of communist rule only in terms of ideology and statistics, and the great dark machinery of the state. We lose the 48 windows, we lose the geraniums, we lose the chess games and the laughter held back at the dinner table. We lose the full weight of what it meant to be a person living inside that system, not a symbol, not a victim, not a hero, but simply a person, getting through a Tuesday, loving the people around them, finding small pleasures in a world that offered very few large ones. Tonight we're going to step inside that world. We're going to walk through its corridors and stand in its queues and sit at its kitchen tables and ride its trams through the grey mornings. We're going to listen. We're going to pay attention to the details that history books sometimes overlook in favour of the great events, the revolutions and the purges and the summits and the falls. Because the great events mattered enormously, but so did the Tuesday afternoons. So did the bread lines and the ration books and the factory whistles and the pioneer meetings and the television programs watched in the blue flickering light of a small screen, while outside the snow fell softly on the street. Communist rule, in its many varieties across its many countries and its many decades, was experienced not primarily as an ideology. It was experienced as a texture of daily life, as the particular smell of a collective farm in autumn, as the sound of a tannoy announcement in a factory, as the weight of a string bag filled with whatever had been available today at the cooperative grocery. It was experienced as the way you spoke differently at home than you spoke at work, the way you learned from childhood that certain thoughts were kept inside and certain words were never said out loud, the way you navigated a world in which the state was everywhere and everything, and yet somehow also oddly absent from the moments that mattered most. We're talking tonight about the Soviet Union, the great original experiment, which stretched across 11 time zones and contained within it more languages and landscapes and peoples than almost any other political entity in history. We're talking about the Eastern Bloc: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Those countries that found themselves on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain after the Second World War and spent the next 4 decades living inside a system that had been imposed upon them with varying degrees of violence and varying degrees of eventual acceptance. We're talking about China, where Mao Zedong's revolution transformed the most populous country on earth with a thoroughness and a ferocity that had no real parallel. We're talking about Cuba, where a small island in the Caribbean became the site of a particular experiment in socialist living. We are talking about Yugoslavia, which tried to find its own path. We are talking about North Korea, where the experiment became something almost incomprehensible to the outside world. All of these places were different. This is the first thing to understand and to hold on to throughout our journey tonight. Communist rule was not a single uniform experience any more than capitalism is a single uniform experience. The life of a factory worker in Moscow in 1955 was different from the life of a factory worker in Warsaw in 1975, which was different again from the life of a factory worker in Shanghai in 1965. The system changed over time. It softened in some places and hardened in others. It produced genuine believers and genuine cynics, and vast numbers of people who were simply trying to live their lives and who held the ideology at arm's length in the privacy of their own minds. And yet there were patterns. There were things that recurred across the borders and the decades: the queues, the shortages, the surveillance, the propaganda, the dual consciousness, the particular resourcefulness and dark humour that seemed to flourish wherever the system took hold. There were common experiences that connected a woman standing in a bread line in Bucharest in 1983 with a man waiting for his work assignment in Beijing in 1968. Not identical experiences, but experiences that rhymed, that shared a rhythm, that came from the same underlying logic of a system that placed the collective above the individual and the state above the person. The night is quiet now. The world outside is still. There is something fitting about exploring this particular history in these hours, because so much of the story of daily life under communist rule was a story of what happened when the official world went quiet, when the factory whistle had blown for the last time and the tannoy had fallen silent and the doors were closed and the family was alone and people could finally, quietly, carefully be themselves. In those moments, in those private hours, the system revealed its limits. It could control what you said in public. It could control where you worked and where you lived and what you read and what you watched. It could not, quite, control what you felt at 3 o'clock in the morning when the apartment was dark and your children were sleeping, and you lay awake listening to the sound of your own heartbeat and thinking thoughts that belonged to no one but you. That gap, that small, stubborn, unkillable gap between the self the state could see and the self that lived inside, is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the human experience of communist rule. We will begin at the beginning before the system was in place, when the promise of it was still new and bright and genuinely believed. We will move forward through the decades, through the great enthusiasm and the great terror and the long grey middle period that historians sometimes call stagnation, but that was, for the people living inside it, simply life. We will linger in the kitchens and the collective farms and the factory floors and the schoolrooms and the hospital waiting rooms. We will listen to voices, reconstructed, imagined into being from the historical record, but rooted in the real testimony of real people who lived these lives and left accounts of them, in memoirs and interviews and letters, and the careful scholarship of historians who have spent their careers trying to understand what it felt like from the inside. So settle in. Let the night gather around you. There is no hurry. We have time for all of it. For every cue and every geranium and every chess game in every stairwell, for every whispered conversation and every moment of unexpected grace. The building with its 48 identical windows is waiting. Let us go inside. To understand what daily life was like under communist rule, it helps to understand first what people were told it was going to be like. Because the gap between the promise and the reality is itself one of the great stories of the 20th century. Not a story of simple lies, though there were lies, but a story of genuine hope colliding with the stubborn complexities of human nature and economic reality, and the particular cruelties that power tends to produce when it is concentrated too completely in too few hands. The promise was, at its heart, extraordinarily appealing. It spoke to people who had nothing. In Russia in 1917, the vast majority of the population were peasants living in conditions that had changed very little in centuries, grinding rural poverty, near total illiteracy, the capricious authority of landlords and officials, the constant threat of famine. The First World War had taken millions of lives and destroyed whatever faith might have remained in the old order. When Lenin's Bolsheviks promised bread, peace and land, they were not promising something abstract. They were promising the most basic things a human being needs. The Bolsheviks promised a world without exploitation, a world where the worker would own the product of her labour, where the fruits of the earth would be shared equally, where the great factories and the great estates would belong not to a handful of wealthy families, but to the people who worked them. They promised free healthcare and free education, the right to a job, the right to a home. They promised that the humiliations of the old order, the cap doffing and the yes sir and the deference paid to wealth and birth, would be swept away. They promised a world of true equals. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, in those chaotic and violent years of civil war and foreign intervention, and famine and disease, the gap between the promise and the reality was perhaps excusable, or at least explicable. Building a new society out of the ruins of the old, in the face of active opposition from within and without, was genuinely difficult. The Bolsheviks made terrible compromises and committed terrible acts, but the dream was still alive in many minds, and many people who had lived under the Tsar looked at even this brutal new order and saw something that might yet become what it had promised. By the 1930s, when Stalin had consolidated his absolute power and the Soviet Union was undergoing the traumatic transformation of industrialization and collectivization, the promise had become more complicated. The propaganda insisted that the promise was being fulfilled, that the new Soviet citizen was the freest, healthiest, best educated, most culturally enriched person in the world. The factories were being built, the tractors were rolling across the fields, the literacy rate was rising. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. These things were partly true, and they were set against a background of terror and forced labour and famine on a scale that was being deliberately hidden from public view. But propaganda works differently than we sometimes imagine. It is not simply a case of authorities telling lies and people believing them. Propaganda works because it tells people what they already want to believe, or what they have learned it is safer to believe, or what they genuinely cannot know is false, because the information that would disprove it is inaccessible to them. A factory worker in Magnitogorsk in 1934, reading in his state newspaper that the Soviet Union was a workers' paradise and the capitalist West was sunk in misery and exploitation, had very little way of knowing whether this was true or false. He had never been to the West. No one he knew had been to the West. The radio told him one thing. The newspaper told him the same thing. His political education classes told him the same thing again, and some of it he could verify with his own eyes. His grandfather had been a serf. He himself could read. His children went to school. There was a hospital in the city. The factory where he worked was enormous and modern, and had been built in what felt like no time at all. Was this not in some sense progress? Was this not evidence that something real was being built? This is the peculiar epistemological trap that communist rule set for its citizens. It mixed genuine achievement with systematic falsification in proportions that were very difficult to disentangle. The achievements were real. The literacy campaigns, the industrialization, the women's emancipation, the expansion of healthcare and education, even if they came at catastrophic human cost and were accompanied by far worse conditions than the propaganda admitted. The falsification was also real. The suppression of information about famines and purges and prison camps, the manufactured statistics, the Potemkin villages built to impress foreign visitors. When communist rule spread to Eastern Europe after the Second World War, it arrived in countries that had their own pre-existing political cultures, their own histories, their own particular relationships to the idea of socialism. In Czechoslovakia, which had been a functioning liberal democracy before the war, the Communist Party came to power in 1948 through a combination of genuine electoral success and behind-the-scenes Soviet pressure. In Poland, which had been devastated by the war and occupied first by the Nazis and then by the Soviets, the new order arrived with the Red Army and was imposed with rather less pretense of popular consent. In Romania and Bulgaria the process was similar. A facade of coalition government rapidly stripped away to reveal a single-party state backed by Soviet power. In China, the Communist Party of Mao Zedong came to power in 1949 after decades of civil war, having genuinely defeated the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek in a military contest. Mao's revolution had deep roots in Chinese society. It had mobilized the peasantry in a way that the Soviet Revolution had never quite done, and it arrived in Beijing with a legitimacy drawn from military victory and the genuine exhaustion of the Chinese people with the old order. The promise in China was, in some ways, even more sweeping than the Soviet promise had been. A total transformation of one of the world's oldest civilizations, the end of a century of humiliation by foreign powers, the building of a new Chinese people. In each of these places the population received the promise differently. Some embraced it wholeheartedly, especially those who had suffered most under the old order, the rural poor, the persecuted minorities, the workers in the most grinding industrial conditions. Some accepted it with the kind of resigned pragmatism, understanding that the new order was here and that it was necessary to find a way to live within it. Some resisted, actively or passively, and paid prices that range from social marginalization to imprisonment to death. And many, perhaps most, occupied some complex middle ground, believing some of the promise and not others, navigating their daily lives in the gap between the official story and the private knowledge that things were not entirely as they were supposed to be. The promise, in every country where communist rule took hold, was accompanied from the very beginning by the apparatus of control. The secret police was not a later corruption of the original ideal. It arrived with the ideology, as an acknowledged necessary instrument for the protection of the revolution against its enemies. The one-party state was not an eventual compromise with the complexity of governing. It was built in from the start. justified by the theory that the party was the vanguard of the working class and therefore uniquely fitted to lead. The censorship was not an unfortunate development. It was a logical extension of the belief that the media should serve the construction of the new society rather than undermine it. These things, the secret police, the single party, the censorship, shaped the texture of daily life from the first days of communist rule. They were not experienced as dramatic intrusions. They became the air, the background condition within which ordinary life was lived. And it is against that background, that constant gentle pressure of the system on every aspect of every day, that we must understand everything else that follows. The alarm sounded at 5:30. In an apartment building on the outskirts of Moscow or Warsaw or Prague or East Berlin, the alarm clock would ring, a small round clock with 2 bells on top, the kind that seems to have been designed to be as unpleasant as possible. And a man or woman would reach out in the dark and press it silent, and lie for a moment in the warmth of the bed before the requirements of the day began to assert themselves. There was a factory shift starting at 7. There was a queue to join before the bread shop opened at 8. There were children to feed and dress and get ready for school. There was no time, really, for lying in bed. This was the rhythm of daily life under communist rule in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Early rising, the long working day, the perpetual negotiations with the system of distribution that was supposed to provide for everyone's needs, and in practice required constant vigilance and effort to navigate. The state promised to take care of its citizens, and in some ways it did. But the care was imperfect and unpredictable, and the citizens learned very quickly that they could not simply wait for the care to arrive. They had to go out and get it. Work was central to everything. In a communist system, the citizen was primarily defined as a worker. Labour was not merely an economic activity. It was a moral category, an expression of one's place in the social order and one's contribution to the collective project. The state was the employer. Private enterprise was illegal or severely restricted in most communist countries for most of the period of communist rule. You worked where the state assigned you to work, and you worked the hours the state required, and your wages were set by the state, and your prospects for advancement depended on a combination of your actual performance, your political reliability, and the complex social calculations of whoever happened to be your supervisor. The Soviet working week was, at various points, 6 days long, 5 days long, with different configurations of rest days that changed with the political winds and the requirements of production. The standard shift in a Soviet factory was 8 hours, but overtime was common and often effectively mandatory. Not legally required, perhaps, but socially required, because the failure to meet production targets was a matter of political as well as economic consequence, and the pressure to exceed targets rather than merely meet them was constant. A worker who consistently underperformed risked not just the disapproval of her supervisor, but a notation in her work record that could follow her for years and affect everything from her housing allocation to her children's educational prospects. The factories themselves were enormous, many of them built in the great industrialization drives of the 1930s or the post-war reconstruction period. Soviet industrial architecture had a grandeur to it, a scale and a solidity that was meant to impress, to demonstrate the productive power of the system. Inside, the reality was often more mixed. The machinery was sometimes old and poorly maintained. The safety standards, despite official regulations, were often inadequate. Workplace injuries were common, and often unreported or underreported because reporting them drew unwanted attention and complicated the production statistics. The heat in summer could be brutal. The cold in winter, in buildings that were often inadequately heated, could be numbing, and yet people formed real communities in those factories. The brigade, the small work unit, typically a dozen or so people who worked together on a specific task, became a genuine social unit, a source of friendship and mutual support. In the Soviet system especially, the brigade had official social functions as well as economic ones. It was the unit through which workers received their political education, through which they were assessed for party membership or awarded socialist honours, through which social pressure was applied to those who were underperforming or stepping out of line. But it was also the unit through which people borrowed money, found out about things that were available to buy, heard the jokes that were circulating, shared food brought from home, and simply talked to each other through the long working hours in the way that people have always talked, wherever they find themselves thrown together. Collective farming, the agricultural system imposed first in the Soviet Union, during the brutal collectivization of the late 1920s and early 1930s, and later in various forms across Eastern Europe and China, was perhaps the most radical transformation of daily life that communist rule imposed. In Russia, a peasant population that had farmed individual plots for generations was forced, often at gunpoint and at the cost of millions of lives, to abandon those plots and merge into collective farms, kolkhozy, where the land, the animals and the equipment belonged to the collective rather than to any individual family. The human cost of collectivization was catastrophic. In Ukraine, the Holodomor, the Great Famine of 1932 and 1933, killed somewhere between 3 and 7 million people, a horror produced by the intersection of forced collectivization, grain seizures, and the deliberate policies of a state that chose to export grain even as its own people starved. In Kazakhstan, the nomadic Kazakh people were forced to settle, and their herds were destroyed, with death tolls proportionally similar. In China, the collectivization drive of the late 1950s, combined with the catastrophic economic policies of the Great Leap Forward, produced a famine that killed between 30 and 45 million people, the largest famine in recorded human history. And yet the collective farm became, for those who survived, a fact of life that shaped everything. By the 1950s and 60s, most collective farmers in the Soviet Union had grown up on the kolkhoz. They had never known individual farming. The system was simply the condition of their existence. They navigated it with the same pragmatic creativity that people always apply to the circumstances they find themselves in. One of the most important features of Soviet collective farm life was the private plot. Despite the official ideology of collective ownership, Soviet collective farmers were permitted to maintain small private plots, typically between 1/4 and 1/2 hectare, where they could grow vegetables and keep some animals for their own consumption or sale at the collective farm market. These plots were enormously productive relative to their size. The energy and care that collective farmers lavished on their private plots, compared to the more grudging labour they performed on collective fields, was one of the most persistent and widely observed features of Soviet agriculture, and one of its most eloquent commentaries. The question of food, how to get it, how to prepare it, how to make it stretch, dominated daily life throughout the communist world in ways that are difficult to convey to people who have grown up in societies of relative abundance. Food distribution in a communist economy worked through a system of state-owned shops stocked with centrally allocated goods, collective farm markets where peasants could sell produce from their private plots at prices somewhat closer to supply and demand, and an elaborate informal system of connections, favours, barter, and the black market. The state shops were often poorly stocked. The relationship between supply and demand in a centrally planned economy was always difficult, and the planning authorities were never able to solve the fundamental problem that consumers' desires were infinitely varied and constantly changing, while production plans were set in advance and extremely difficult to adjust. The result was a peculiar pattern of simultaneous shortage and surplus, shortages of the things people wanted, surpluses of things no one wanted. In Soviet grocery stores, there might be cans of fish and jars of pickled vegetables in abundance while the shelves where bread should have been were empty. Shoes were often available in sizes no one needed. Winter coats appeared in summer. Shopping required strategy, patience, and a network of informants. The moment a shipment of something desirable arrived at a shop, word spread with remarkable speed. A queue would form, sometimes within minutes, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes organized by the first arrivals. The queue was one of the defining institutions of daily life under communist rule. Soviet citizens spent, on average, estimates suggest, something like an hour and a half to 2 hours every day in queues. Over a lifetime, this represented years of standing, years spent waiting for bread, waiting for shoes, waiting at the post office, waiting at the housing office, waiting at the doctor's surgery, waiting for the tram. The queue was not merely a passive experience, it had its own social codes and hierarchies. There were written and unwritten rules about placekeeping. You could leave your place in a queue if you wrote your name on a piece of paper and left it, and the queue would honor your place when you returned, within certain time limits. There were wars of nerves over whether people were jumping the queue. There were authorities, often elderly women of formidable aspect, who self-appointed as queue monitors and enforced the rules with vigor. And there was conversation, an enormous amount of conversation, because the queue was one of the few places where strangers found themselves unavoidably in proximity for extended periods, and conversation filled the time. In East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, daily life had some features that distinguished it from the Soviet model. East Germany was economically the most successful of the Eastern Bloc countries, and by the 1970s it had achieved a standard of living that was, by communist standards, genuinely reasonable. The queues were shorter, the shops were better stocked. There was a peculiarly German efficiency to some of the bureaucratic processes that the system required. But the fundamental structures of communist daily life were present. The single party, the pervasive secret police, the Stasi, one of the most comprehensive surveillance organizations in history, the travel restrictions, the censorship, the requirement to perform loyalty to the state. Housing was allocated by the state in most communist countries. You did not choose where to live, you applied and you waited, and eventually you were assigned an apartment of a size determined by the number of people in your family and your position in various official hierarchies. The wait for a state apartment could be many years. In the meantime, families doubled up, 3 generations living in 2 rooms, with arrangements that required extraordinary patience and mutual accommodation. The standard Soviet apartment, particularly in the Khrushchev era of the 1950s and 60s, when massive building programs produced millions of small standardized units, was compact. A typical 2-room apartment in a Khrushchevka, the standardized prefabricated buildings that transform the Soviet urban landscape, had a kitchen of perhaps 6 or 8 square meters, a small bathroom, and 2 rooms serving as bedroom and living room combined. For a family of 3 or 4, this was tight. For a family of 5 or 6, it was genuinely cramped, and yet these small apartments were transformed, over time, into homes. Soviet citizens were extraordinarily skilled at personalizing their spaces, at covering the identical grey concrete walls with wallpaper, chosen from a limited but personally selected range, at arranging the limited available furniture to create a sense of privacy within tiny rooms, at filling window sills with plants and shelves with books. The book was, in fact, one of the great objects of Soviet domestic culture. Books were collected, displayed, lent, and borrowed, read and reread, with an intensity that came partly from genuine literary culture. The Soviet literacy campaigns had created a population of avid readers, and partly from the fact that entertainment options were limited and books were relatively cheap and abundant. Getting to work required navigating the public transport system, which was in most communist cities genuinely impressive. The Moscow Metro, opened in 1935, was designed to be a palace of the people. Its stations were decorated with marble and mosaics and heroic sculptures, deliberately built as a demonstration of what a workers' state could achieve. The system was efficient, clean, and extraordinarily cheap. Across the communist world, public transport was subsidized to near invisibility. The fare on a tram or a bus was so low as to be almost notional. This was a genuine achievement, genuinely valued by the people who used it, even as they complained about the crowds and the delays and the buses that never seemed to run to schedule. The working day ended in the late afternoon, and the evening hours had their own particular quality. People returned home through the blue-grey light of winter dusk, stopping at shops along the way, conducting the evening's negotiations with the distribution system, checking what was available today, calculating what was needed for tomorrow, carrying the heavy string bag that Soviet women always seemed to carry, filled with whatever had been found. Then home, and the preparation of the evening meal, and the children's homework, and perhaps an hour in front of the television, a small, not very sharp black and white screen in the 1960s and 70s, gradually replaced by colour sets in the 80s, watching whatever the state had chosen to broadcast that evening. Soviet television was not entirely without merit. There were genuinely good films produced within the constraints of the system, films that managed to say meaningful things about human experience while navigating the political requirements. There were educational programs and natural history documentaries and variety shows, and there was a great deal of material that was purely propagandistic and which audiences sat through with the particular glazed patience of people who have learned that some performances are simply to be endured. Then to sleep, in the apartment that was small but warm enough, in a bed that was not especially comfortable but was a bed, in a night that was quiet apart from the sound of the building settling and the occasional distant sound of a tram on the street below. Tomorrow the alarm would ring at 5:30. Tomorrow the queue would be different. Some things available that had not been yesterday, some things gone that had seemed certain. Tomorrow the factory whistle would sound at 7. Tomorrow the day would begin again, in all its demanding, exhausting, fully human complexity. There is a particular feeling that people who lived under communist rule describe when they try to explain what it was like, a feeling that is not quite fear, though fear was part of it, and not quite paranoia, though paranoia was part of it too. The feeling is perhaps best captured by the Russian word that circulated as dark humour in the Soviet Union. They said that even the walls had ears, and they were not entirely joking. The surveillance systems developed by communist states were, in many cases, the most comprehensive in human history up to that point. The Soviet secret police started, the Cheka, then the GPU, then the OGPU, then the NKVD, then the MGB, then the KGB, the names changing as the organization evolved but the fundamental function remaining constant, was a state within the state, a parallel power structure that operated with its own courts, its own prisons, its own logic. At its height during the Stalinist terror of the 1930s, the NKVD could arrest, try and execute a person within a matter of days with no meaningful recourse to any external legal process. But the most insidious form of surveillance was not the secret police itself. It was the network of informers that the secret police cultivated among the ordinary population. Every apartment building, every factory, every collective farm, every office had its informers, people who reported to the authorities on their neighbours and colleagues and friends. Sometimes these informers were volunteers, true believers who genuinely thought they were serving the revolution by reporting suspicious behaviour. Sometimes they were people who'd been compromised, caught in some minor illegality or personal scandal, and were reporting under duress, the alternative being worse. Sometimes they were simply opportunists, seeking advantages in a system where access to power was otherwise limited. The result was a social atmosphere of profound uncertainty. You could never quite be sure who among the people around you was an informer. Your colleague who laughed at the same jokes you laughed at. Was he telling someone about those jokes? Your neighbour, who seemed so friendly over the communal stairwell. Had she mentioned to anyone the foreign radio program she had heard coming from your apartment last Tuesday evening? You could not know, and so you learned to be careful. You learned the specific art of Aesopian communication, saying things in ways that could be read as innocent if they were reported, but that contained meanings legible to those you trusted. The East German Stasi, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the Ministry for State Security, took this surveillance culture to an extreme that has been extensively documented since the reunification of Germany and the opening of the Stasi archives. The Stasi employed approximately 91,000 full-time staff and an estimated 174,000 unofficial informers among a population of 16 million. This was one informer for roughly every 90 people, a density of surveillance that far exceeded even the KGB. The Stasi kept files on an estimated 6 million people, nearly 40% of the East German population. These files contained not just political information but intimate personal details, love affairs, family conflicts, health problems, secret ambitions. The Stasi also developed a technique called Zersetzung, literally decomposition or corrosion, for dealing with people who were suspected of opposition but against whom there was insufficient evidence for arrest. Zersetzung involved subtle, targeted harassment designed to destroy the target's sense of reality and social relationships without their ever knowing the source of the destruction. Stasi officers would enter a target's apartment while she was out and move objects slightly, rearranging books, turning pictures at a small angle, leaving no evidence of intrusion, but creating the unsettling sense that the apartment had been entered. They would arrange for anonymous letters to be sent to the target's friends containing damaging false information. They would arrange for the target to experience small professional setbacks and social rejections, coordinated through the Stasi's network of informers in every institution. The goal was to make the target doubt herself, distrust those around her, gradually lose her moorings in reality. It was, in its way, one of the most psychologically sophisticated forms of persecution ever systematically practiced. Propaganda was the other great instrument of social control, and it is worth understanding what made it effective, because it was not effective in the way that simple deception is effective. The populations of communist countries were not in general naive. They knew that their newspapers told them a particular version of the truth. They knew that statistics were manipulated and that official accounts omitted inconvenient facts. The dark humour of every communist country was full of jokes about the gap between official reality and experienced reality. The most famous example from the Soviet Union: the future is certain, it's only the past that keeps changing. Or, what is the difference between capitalism and socialism? Under capitalism, man exploits man. Under socialism, it is the reverse. Or the joke about the Soviet newspaper Pravda. Pravda means truth, in which a man is found dead with Pravda wrapped around his head. What happened, someone asks. He read it and believed it, comes the reply. This humour was a form of truth-telling in a system that made official truth-telling dangerous. But it also served a psychological function. It allowed people to maintain a sense of lucidity and self-respect, to demonstrate to each other that they were not fooled, while simultaneously living within the system that the humour mocked. The joke about Pravda did not require the teller to actually cancel his subscription or write a letter of protest. It simply acknowledged, in the safe container of comedy, what everyone knew. Propaganda worked less through conviction than through saturation and normalization. If every newspaper, every radio program, every school lesson, every workplace meeting, every public ceremony, every officially sanctioned cultural product told the same story about the world, the story in which the Soviet Union or the People's Republic was building a bright socialist future, while the capitalist world was sunk in exploitation and misery, then even those who doubted found it difficult to construct an alternative account, because the alternative account had no official existence, and therefore no official vocabulary. The concepts needed to think clearly about certain political realities were systematically absent from public discourse. Children were particularly susceptible to this form of normalization, simply because for children there is no before. The world they are born into is simply the world, and its assumptions are absorbed along with everything else. Soviet children in the 1950s and 60s genuinely could not imagine a different kind of society, because they had no experience of one and very limited access to information about one. They knew that the West existed, in a vague and negative way, as a place of capitalist exploitation, racial discrimination, unemployment, and cultural decadence. This was not entirely false, and its partiality was invisible to them because the information that would have completed the picture was not available. The youth organizations that every communist state maintained were crucial instruments of this normalization. The Soviet pioneers, Всесоюзная пионерская Organizacja Imeni V. Leninina, enrolled virtually every Soviet child between the ages of 9 and 14. The organization had its own uniform, its own pledge, its own hierarchy of ranks, its own activities and ceremonies and summer camps. Membership was theoretically voluntary, and in practice all but universal. The social pressure to join was overwhelming, and the child who refused would find herself significantly disadvantaged in ways ranging from the social to the academic. The pioneers filled an important social function as well as a political one. Summer pioneer camps provided children with experiences, swimming, hiking, organized games, theatrical performances, campfires, that they might not otherwise have had access to. The camps were genuinely enjoyed by many children who went to them. The political content was there, the songs about Lenin, the pledge of loyalty to the Communist Party, the lessons about the superiority of the socialist system, but it was woven into a texture of ordinary childhood pleasure that made it difficult to separate the indoctrination from the fun. The workplace was another site of mandatory political life. Regular political education meetings in Russian, politikobe, political studies, required workers to demonstrate their knowledge of Marxist-Leninist ideology and to discuss the current political line. These meetings were widely regarded as a bore. Workers sat through them with the particular flat patience of people fulfilling an unavoidable obligation, said what was expected of them, and returned to their actual work as soon as the minimum requirement had been met. The meetings were a performance, and both performers and audience knew it, but the performance was required, and had to be given. There were also the great public ceremonies, May Day, the anniversary of the October Revolution, the various national holidays that punctuated the communist calendar. These could be genuinely spectacular. The military parades on Red Square, with their columns of soldiers in perfect precision and their missile carriers rolling past the Lenin Mausoleum where the Soviet leadership stood in review, were meant to impress. And they did impress, both foreign observers and Soviet citizens watching on television. There was genuine pride available in these spectacles, the pride of a great power demonstrating its strength and organization. But the ceremonies also required participation. You were expected to attend the workplace rally, to march in the parade, to hold the banner, to cheer at the right moments. Refusal was not simply antisocial, it was a political act, and political acts attracted attention. So people marched and cheered, and whether they felt anything genuine behind the performance was their own private business, something they shared perhaps with their closest friends and family, or perhaps with no one at all. The experience of social control was not uniform across the communist world or across the decades. The Stalinist terror of the 1930s and 40s was qualitatively different from the more relaxed, though still firmly authoritarian atmosphere of the Khrushchev years. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 crushed by Soviet tanks, the Prague Spring of 1968, also crushed by Soviet tanks, and the Polish Solidarity movement of the early 1980s all demonstrated that the control was not absolute, that resistance was possible, that the gap between the system and the people inside it could widen into something visible and powerful, even if it was ultimately for a time suppressed. But for most people, in most places, on most days, the response to social control was neither enthusiastic compliance nor active resistance. It was the particular form of passive accommodation that the anthropologist James C. Scott called weapons of the weak, small, everyday acts of quiet non-compliance that stopped short of open defiance, but that carved out a space of genuine autonomy within the system's demands. You did the minimum required at the political education meeting. You worked slowly on the collective field but lavished attention on your private plot. You told the joke about Pravda to your trusted friends. You listened to foreign radio broadcasts late at night with the volume turned very low. You found 1,000 small ways to be yourself within the space that the system had left you. There was a photograph that appeared in many Soviet homes. It was printed in enormous numbers and hung on walls in schools and offices and factories and the living rooms of families across 11 time zones. It showed Lenin in the warm colours of a propaganda poster, surrounded by children, smiling, reaching out to him, their faces turned up in expressions of joy and trust. The caption, or its equivalent, was always some version of "Lenin loves children." It was meant to suggest the benevolent paternalism of the socialist state, the idea that the revolution was ultimately about the well-being of the young, and yet the actual experience of raising children under communist rule was considerably more complex than this idealized image suggested. The state did care about children. It provided free education, free health care, subsidized childcare, and a variety of social supports that were genuinely valuable and that represented real improvements over the pre-revolutionary condition of most families. But the state's care came with its own demands, the demand that children be educated into the system, shaped into the ideal Soviet citizen, given the correct understanding of history and politics and their place in the collective. The Soviet kindergarten, the Detsky Sade, the children's garden, was one of the most important institutions of daily life and one of the most revealing. Opened from the early morning to accommodate the long working hours of both parents, the kindergarten provided not just childcare, but systematic early socialization. Children as young as 3 were learning to eat together at long tables, to sleep simultaneously at nap time, to participate in group activities, to subordinate individual impulse to collective routine. The kindergarten teachers, almost always women, part of the vast feminized workforce of the care economy, were skilled and often genuinely dedicated. They taught songs and games and elementary knowledge. They also taught quietly and consistently the assumptions that would structure a child's understanding of the world she was growing up in. Soviet education was, in many respects, genuinely impressive. The emphasis on mathematics and the natural sciences produced excellent scientists and engineers. The emphasis on literature and cultural history produced a population of enthusiastic readers. The schools were well funded relative to the country's overall economic situation. The teachers were reasonably well trained, and the curriculum was demanding. A Soviet secondary school graduate had typically studied algebra and geometry, physics and chemistry, literature and history and geography, and at least one foreign language, usually English or German, with a thoroughness that compared favourably with secondary education in many Western countries. But the curriculum was also shaped at every point by ideological requirements. History was the most obviously affected subject. Soviet history textbooks were not neutral accounts of the past, but arguments for a particular interpretation of history, one in which the Communist Party was always right and its enemies always wrong, and in which inconvenient events were either omitted or reinterpreted. The versions of history taught in Soviet schools were revised repeatedly as the political line changed. Stalin was a great leader until he was not, and textbooks had to be updated accordingly, pages sometimes literally cut out or pasted over. Literature classes were shaped by the doctrine of socialist realism, the official aesthetic principle that required art and literature to depict reality, not as it was but as it ought to be in the socialist future, to show positive heroes and progressive struggles and the inevitable triumph of the working class. The great Russian writers of the 19th century, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Turgenev, were part of the curriculum because they could not really be excluded from any serious Russian literary education, but they were taught through an ideological frame that sometimes did violence to what they were actually about. Dostoevsky's profound religious pessimism, for instance, did not sit easily with the official materialism of the Soviet state. For the arts in general, the communist world was a place of strange contrasts, of genuine cultural achievement and genuine cultural suppression existing in uncomfortable proximity. The Soviet Union produced extraordinary musicians. The piano competitions, the ballet companies, the orchestras, these were world-class, genuinely excellent, supported by the state with resources and seriousness that produced results. The Bolshoi Ballet was not propaganda, it was extraordinary. The composers Shostakovich and Prokofiev, the pianists Richter and Gilels, the celloist Rostropovich. These were artists of the highest order, working within the Soviet system and in complex negotiation with it. Shostakovich's story is perhaps the most illuminating. His Fifth Symphony, composed in 1937 after his previous work had been publicly denounced by the state, and he was in genuine fear for his life, was received as a model of Soviet music, powerful, accessible, patriotic. But Shostakovich later suggested through his memoirs published after his death, a suggestion that remains debated among musicologists, that the apparent triumph of the symphony's final movement was in fact ironic, a forced march rather than a genuine celebration, and that those who listened carefully could hear the grief beneath the jubilation. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, it captures something essential about the experience of art under communist rule. the requirement to speak in a double voice, to say one thing on the surface and mean another thing below. The question of leisure was interesting and revealing. Communist states were, in theory, committed to the flourishing of working-class culture, to providing the workers with access to theatre and concert halls and museums and libraries that had previously been the preserve of the wealthy, and in practice this commitment produced real results. Soviet cinema tickets were extraordinarily cheap. Theatre tickets were subsidized. Museums were free or nearly so. The public library system was extensive and genuinely used. But leisure was not entirely private. It was also a space of official guidance. The trade union, which in a communist state was not an independent organization representing workers' interests against management, but rather an arm of the state's management of the workforce, organized cultural excursions and holidays and amateur theatrical groups and sports competitions. These were sometimes genuinely enjoyed. They were also opportunities for the party to maintain its presence in the non-working hours of citizens' lives. The dachas, the small country houses or garden plots that Soviet citizens of the middle class aspired to, were perhaps the most genuinely private space available. A dacha was typically very simple, a small wooden house, perhaps 2 or 3 rooms, with a garden where vegetables were grown with the same intensity of care lavished on the private plots of collective farm workers. The dacha was where a family could be most fully themselves. It was away from the neighbours who might hear what was said. It was outside the factory and the housing block and the political meeting. You could dig in the earth and eat tomatoes warm from the vine, and let the children run in the long grass and feel, for a few summer hours, the particular ease of a life uncrowded by the system. The role of women in communist countries was one of the most complex aspects of the system, genuinely transformed in some ways, burdened in others. The official ideology of communism was committed to gender equality. Women were to be full participants in the workforce, full citizens with equal political rights, freed from the domestic servitude that capitalism supposedly imposed. And there was real progress along these lines. Soviet women entered the workforce in very high numbers. By the 1960s, a higher percentage of Soviet women were employed than women in any Western country. Women had access to abortion and contraception, at least in theory, and at least at certain periods. Women achieved high educational levels and professional standing in medicine, science and engineering in proportions that the West would not reach until decades later. But the transformation was incomplete in ways that created a particular burden. The double shift was the most visible manifestation. Soviet women worked full-time outside the home, because the system required it, and because the family's income required it, and then came home to work a second full shift maintaining the household, cooking the meals, doing the laundry, raising the children. This was not so different from the experience of women in the capitalist world at the same period, but it was made significantly heavier by the conditions of the communist economy, the queues, the shortages, the need to find and carry and process food and other necessities that the market system simply made available. A Western woman in 1970 could buy a supermarket's vast range of processed and prepared foods. A Soviet woman in 1970 was likely still making most things from scratch, having stood in several queues that afternoon to obtain the raw materials. Family life found its warmth in the small spaces the system left between its requirements. The kitchen table was perhaps the most important. In the small Soviet apartment, the kitchen was often the most intimate room. Too small for formal entertaining, just right for sitting with 2 or 3 people and talking in low voices about real things. The kitchen conversations of Soviet intellectual life. The intelligentsia gathered around small tables in cramped kitchens, Drinking tea from glasses in metal holders and talking about books and ideas and the condition of the country were one of the defining cultural forms of the era. The kitchen was where the public mask could be set aside, where the double voice could speak its true register. Religion, which communist ideology treated as a remnant of pre-scientific superstition and an instrument of bourgeois oppression, was suppressed to varying degrees across the communist world and across the decades. Churches were closed, religious leaders arrested, religious education prohibited, and yet religion persisted, stubbornly, quietly, in the way that belief tends to persist when it cannot be openly practiced but can be privately held. In Russia, the Orthodox Church survived decades of official atheism, reduced but not extinguished, its faith maintained by grandmothers who taught their grandchildren to pray in whispers, who kept icons hidden in drawers, who passed on a sense of the sacred that the state had not managed to eradicate. What did it feel like? This is the question that the historical record can answer only partially, because feelings leave fewer traces than facts, and because the particular feelings generated by life under communist rule were often the feelings that people were most careful not to record or express. And yet the accounts that do exist, in memoirs and in oral history interviews and in the literature and art produced within and around the communist world, allow us to construct something of an emotional portrait. The most fundamental emotional feature of life under communist rule was what might be called the management of the gap, the constant low-level cognitive work of maintaining two simultaneous accounts of reality, the official account and the private account, and keeping them from colliding in dangerous ways. Everyone who lived under communist rule for any length of time became to some degree a skilled performer, performing loyalty, performing enthusiasm, performing belief. And the performance was exhausting. The Soviet émigré writer Vasily Grossman, in his great novel Life and Fate, a novel so dangerous that the KGB confiscated not just the manuscript but the typewriter ribbons it had been written on, described the inner life of his characters with a precision that no official account could match. His characters live in the gap between the official story and the truth they know. They perform, and they suffer, and they love. And the performance and the suffering and the love are all mixed together in ways that make each of them heavier. The fear was real, and it changed shape across the decades. In the Stalinist period, the fear was acute and immediate. People disappeared. Your neighbor was arrested and not seen again. Your colleague was denounced at a factory meeting and within days had vanished from her desk. The terror was not random. It targeted certain categories of people more than others, but its logic was opaque enough that almost anyone could believe themselves potentially at risk. A joke told to the wrong person, a letter written too candidly, an ancestor from the wrong social class, a connection to someone who had already been arrested. Any of these could be enough. The terror produced a profound social atomization. When the potential enemy might be the person sitting next to you at dinner, the rational response was to trust no one outside your most intimate circle, and sometimes not even there. Families turned on each other. Children reported their parents. Friends denounced friends. This was not the majority experience. Most people, even in the worst years, did not betray those they loved. But the possibility of betrayal was always present, and the knowledge of its possibility shaped every relationship. After Stalin's death in 1953 and Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, in which Khrushchev, speaking to the closed 20th Party Congress, acknowledged some of Stalin's crimes and denounced the cult of personality, the acute fear of the Stalinist period relaxed into something different. The mass terror ended. Millions of people were released from the labor camps. blinking into a world that had changed in their absence. The possibility of arbitrary arrest for a careless word diminished significantly, but the fear did not disappear. It became more specific and more manageable. You knew roughly what you could and could not say, roughly who you could trust, roughly where the lines were drawn. The consequence of crossing those lines was less likely to be death than in Stalin's time, more likely to be the loss of a job, or the inability to travel, or the blocking of your children's educational prospects. These were serious consequences. They were enough to maintain compliance in most cases, but they were consequences you could calculate and navigate. The psychological culture that developed in response to these conditions was, in some ways, remarkably rich. The constraint on public expression seemed to intensify private life. The conversations that could not happen in public happened in private, with an intensity and an intellectual seriousness that those who participated in them remember as one of the genuine goods of that era. Soviet intellectual and cultural life within its constraints was genuinely vibrant. The literature that navigated and sometimes evaded the censorship was read with a hunger and a closeness of attention that free societies rarely produce, because every text carried the weight of what it was saying and also the weight of what it was not allowed to say. The dark humor was also a form of psychological survival. The Soviet and Eastern European tradition of political jokes, anecdote, was extraordinarily sophisticated. These jokes circulated by word of mouth, impossible to suppress because they left no trace, available to everyone regardless of their official position, a democracy of laughter in a system that suppressed most other forms of democracy. The jokes were often brilliant in their compression and their double meaning, and their very existence was a kind of resistance, a proof that the system had not managed to colonize the inner life of its citizens. Alongside the fear and the double consciousness, there was also something that should not be minimized, a genuine sense of collective purpose, at least at certain times and in certain places. The early decades of communist rule, whatever their crimes, generated something real in the people who lived through them, a sense of participating in a great historical project, of building something new and important. The industrialization of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, for all its brutality, also produced genuine heroism and genuine sacrifice and genuine pride in achievement. The recovery from the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in the Soviet Union, with a weight of truth and pride that the name carries to this day, was a collective experience of suffering and endurance, an eventual triumph that bonded a generation in ways that no propaganda could entirely manufacture. And there was love. There was always love, between parents and children, between husbands and wives, between friends. The geraniums in the window boxes were love. The dacha garden tended with obsessive care was love. The chess games in the stairwell were love, of a quiet masculine kind. The kitchen table conversations were love. The book lent to a friend carefully, with the suggestion that certain pages were especially worth reading, a way of saying things that could not be said out loud, was love. Human beings find ways to love each other within whatever constraints they're given, and the constraints of communist rule, formidable as they were, did not prevent this. What the system did do was make certain forms of love and certain forms of selfhood more difficult and costly than they needed to be. It took from people the right to choose their own path in fundamental ways, where to live, where to work, what to read, how to speak in public, how to raise their children. It asked them to perform what they did not feel, and to suppress what they did feel. It created a condition of permanent slight unreality, a distance between the self and the world that many people who lived through it describe as one of its most wearing features. But people were not broken by it. This is the other great truth. The human capacity for adaptation, for finding meaning and pleasure within constraint, for turning even the most rigid system into something livable, proved stronger than the system's architects had imagined. People were not the instruments the state thought they were. They were something considerably more complicated and more resilient, something that the system could shape but never quite control, something that survived quietly and stubbornly in 48 identical windows and the geraniums on their sills. There are more stories to tell. The history of daily life under communist rule is deep enough and wide enough that we could spend many nights here, many nights moving through its rooms and listening at its doors. So let us go deeper, into the corners and the details, into the decades and the countries that each had their own particular texture of communist daily life, into the remarkable and the ordinary and everything in between. The black market existed everywhere that official markets failed to provide what people needed, which is to say, everywhere under communist rule. The black market was not a single institution with a single character. It ranged from massive organized criminal enterprises to the most informal imaginable exchanges between individuals who happened to have something the other wanted. In the Soviet Union, the informal economy that operated outside the official planned economy was so extensive that it has been estimated to have accounted for between 10 and 20% of all economic activity. Without it, the official economy would quite simply not have functioned. The forms of black market activity were endlessly varied. Taxi drivers might operate unofficial private taxis alongside or instead of their state employment. Doctors might see private patients outside their hospital hours for payment in kind. A bottle of cognac, a box of chocolates, the promise of a favour returned. Craftsmen whose official employment was in a factory might do private repair work in the evenings, using tools borrowed from the factory. Farmers might divert some portion of the collective farm's produce to the black market, rather than delivering it to the state procurement system. Managers might arrange for state materials to be diverted to private use. Everyone at some level participated. The Blatt system, from the Russian slang for pull, influence or connections, was the lubricant that made Soviet daily life run despite the friction of the official system. Blatt was the exchange of favours and connections that allowed you to get things done that the official system made impossible or interminably slow. You knew someone who worked in a department store and could tell you when a shipment of good shoes was expected, and you returned the favour by letting her know when your factory was producing something desirable. You had a connection in the housing office who could advance your place on the apartment waiting list, and she had a daughter who needed a school recommendation from someone in your position. The web of these connections was intricate and essential, a parallel infrastructure of daily life that operated entirely on trust and reciprocity. Alexandra Petrovna, not her real name but the composite of many real women, was 53 years old in 1975 and lived in a 2-room apartment in Leningrad with her husband and her elderly mother. She worked as a librarian at one of the city's public libraries, a good position, relatively speaking, one that gave her access to books before they reached the general public, which made her a valuable link in the informal lending networks of the intelligentsia. Her husband was an engineer at a machine tools factory. Her mother, who'd survived the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War, kept the apartment supplied with pickles and preserves put up from the Dasha garden during the summer, and presided over the household with an authority derived from having endured things that the younger generation could barely imagine. Alexandra's day began at 6. She made breakfast for the 3 of them. Kasha, the buckwheat porridge that was the staple of Soviet morning life, with butter when butter was available and without it when it wasn't. She packed her husband's lunch, a sandwich of black bread and cheese, a hard-boiled egg, because the factory cafeteria was adequate but not good enough to rely on exclusively. She made her mother's tea, the glass in its silver holder that her mother had brought from the apartment where she had lived before the war, one of the very few objects that had survived that time. Then she put on her coat and her good shoes, the ones saved for work, not the outdoor boots, and went out into the morning. The library opened at 9. She was there by 8:30, processing the previous day's returned books, checking the catalogue, preparing the new acquisitions that would be shelved today. The library was warm and quiet and smelled of paper, one of the few spaces in the city that was reliably warm and quiet and smelled of something she loved. She knew her regular readers by name and by preference. She knew who was working through Tolstoy and who had developed a sudden interest in pre-revolutionary architecture and who wanted anything at all by Bulgakov, whose Master and Margarita had recently become available after decades of suppression and was passing from reader to reader with an eagerness that she found deeply moving. At lunchtime, she went to the cooperative grocery 2 streets away and spent 40 minutes in the queue for eggs, which had arrived that morning. She bought 2 dozen, 1 dozen for her own household, 1 dozen to give to her colleague Tamara, whose mother was ill and who could not get away from work to queue. This transaction was not unusual. It was simply what you did for the people in your network. Next week it would be Tamara who waited in a queue for something Alexandra needed. She was home by 6:30. Her mother had already started the dinner, a soup of cabbage and potatoes with a ham bone that had been simmering since noon, a smell that filled the stairwell and made the neighbours' children knock on the door to ask what was cooking. After dinner, her husband read. Her mother watched the television, her interest focused mainly on a popular variety show that she refused to miss. Alexandra wrote letters to her sister in Minsk, to her old university friend who had somehow managed to get a position in Moscow and whose letters came back full of careful, oblique information about conditions there. She wrote in the particular code of people who knew their correspondence might be read, not political code, not the code of dissidents, but the simple social code of people who had learned to say private things in ways that sounded innocent. The healthcare system of the communist world was, like so much else, a story of genuine achievement shadowed by significant failure. The Soviet Union made remarkable progress in basic public health over the 20th century. Life expectancy, which was devastatingly low in the pre-revolutionary period, rose substantially through the middle decades of the century, and epidemic diseases that had ravaged the population were brought under control through mass vaccination programs and improvements in basic sanitation. The principle of universal free healthcare, while imperfectly realized, represented a real commitment and produced real results in terms of basic health security. But the system had its own pathologies. The shortage economy that afflicted other areas of Soviet life also affected medicine. Medicines were sometimes unavailable, sometimes hoarded, sometimes accessible only through the informal economy. Hospital equipment was often outdated. The quality of medical care varied enormously depending on where you lived and who you were. Senior party officials had access to special clinics, with standards equivalent to the best Western facilities, while ordinary workers in rural areas might wait months for a specialist appointment. The relationship between patient and doctor was also complicated by the system's incentive structures. Soviet doctors were paid by the state on a salary basis, without the additional pressures of a market system but also without many of the rewards for excellence that a market system provides. The quality of individual doctors varied as much as it does anywhere, but the structures that in a market system might reward excellent care and punish poor care were absent or weakened. And the political culture of the Soviet workplace, which valued the avoidance of errors over the acknowledgement of them, made it difficult for medical mistakes to be examined openly and learned from. People navigated the healthcare system with the same combination of official channels and informal networks that they used for everything else. The doctor who was also a family friend, or the friend of a friend, was worth more than any number of official appointments. A small gift, cognac, chocolates, a pair of stockings, left on the desk of the right nurse could transform an interminable wait into a reasonable one. This was not corruption in any absolute sense. It was the informal adjustment of an imperfect official system by people with human needs and limited options. Travel was one of the most significant restrictions of life under communist rule, and it shaped daily experience in ways both obvious and subtle. Travel within the communist country was generally possible, if sometimes bureaucratically complicated. Travel to the West was, for most citizens in most communist countries for most of the period, effectively impossible. You could apply for an exit visa. The application would take months. It would be reviewed by security services. It might be denied without explanation. The act of applying was itself a kind of exposure. It suggested a desire to leave, which could be interpreted as dissatisfaction with the system. The effect of this restriction on the mental horizon is difficult to convey. We live in a world where the idea of being unable to leave your country, not for any specific crime committed, but simply as a default condition of citizenship, is associated with the most extreme forms of political control. But for Soviet citizens and for most citizens of Eastern Bloc countries, this was simply the condition of their existence. The world beyond the Iron Curtain was known through official propaganda, through illegal radio broadcasts, through the occasional foreign publication that circulated from hand to hand, through the stories of the very few who had travelled and returned. It was known at a distance, partially, through a glass darkly. This is not to say that communist countries were entirely closed. Tourism within the communist world existed. Soviet tourists travelled to Prague and East Berlin and Budapest and Warsaw. Student exchanges and scientific conferences created some traffic across the curtain in both directions. But the traffic was carefully controlled, and the experience of the vast majority was one of profound isolation from the wider world. The experience of different social classes under communist rule is a topic that the official ideology made difficult to discuss, since communist ideology officially denied that class distinctions remained in a socialist society. But of course they did remain, in new forms. The party elite, the nomenklatura in Soviet terminology, lived very differently from ordinary workers. They had access to special shops stocked with goods unavailable to the general public. They had dachas that were substantially larger and better appointed than those of ordinary citizens. They had cars. Private ownership of cars was relatively rare among ordinary Soviet citizens, but party officials had state cars with drivers. They travelled more freely. They lived in better apartments in better buildings in better parts of the city. Below the nomenklatura, a more complex hierarchy developed. Urban workers generally lived better than rural collective farmers. Industrial workers in large cities generally lived better than those in smaller towns. Workers with skills that were in high demand generally lived better than those without. Workers whose positions gave them access to desirable goods, a doctor who could prescribe medicines, a food industry worker who could bring home extra provisions, a shop assistant who could set aside the best items before they reached the general queue, had informal advantages that translated into real improvements in daily life. The lives of those at the very bottom of the system, the convicts in the labour camps, the deportees sent to work in inhospitable regions, the ethnic minorities subjected to particular discrimination, were of a darkness that deserves its own careful attention. The Soviet Gulag, the network of forced labour camps that had millions of prisoners at its height in the late Stalinist period, was not a peripheral feature of Soviet daily life but a central one. It was present in the consciousness of every Soviet citizen in the way that a terrible danger present just off the edge of vision shapes everything you do, even when you cannot see it directly. The people who were sent to the Gulag were not only genuine opponents of the system, they were also people arrested on fabricated charges, people caught by the expanding net of denunciation, people from the wrong social class or the wrong nationality, people who happened to be in the wrong place when a quota needed to be filled. Every family eventually knew someone who'd been in the camps or had heard of someone who had been. The camps were an absence in every family, a silence around certain names. The rehabilitation of millions of camp survivors after Stalin's death was one of the most extraordinary social phenomena of the 20th century. Millions of people returning from years of forced labour to find that the world had changed, their families had changed, they themselves had changed, and that there was no official mechanism for acknowledging what had happened to them, no public truth-telling, no apology. They returned, and they found their old apartments occupied by others, their work records blank, their pasts invisible, and they were expected to simply resume. Many of them managed. The human capacity for resumption, for finding one's footing again, is remarkable. China under Mao presented a variant of the communist daily life experience that differed in important ways from the Soviet model, while sharing its fundamental structures. The Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976 was in some ways a more thorough assault on the private self than anything attempted in the Soviet Union outside the worst Stalinist years. The Red Guards, organized units of young people, often teenagers, mobilized to destroy the four olds: old culture, old customs, old habits, old ideas, ransacked homes in search of books, artworks, religious objects, family photographs, anything that could be labelled a remnant of the pre-revolutionary past. Teachers and intellectuals were subjected to public struggle sessions, denunciation meetings at which they were forced to stand before crowds of accusers, often their own students, and confess to counter-revolutionary thoughts and attitudes. These sessions were designed to be humiliating, and they were. The intellectual was not just punished, he was made to perform his own punishment, to declare himself guilty of the very things he was accused of, to participate in his own degradation. Many people were permanently damaged by these experiences. Some were killed, some killed themselves. And yet, even within the Cultural Revolution, people found spaces for ordinary life. They fell in love. They told jokes to the people they trusted. They kept hidden, in the spaces between the walls or under the floorboards, the books and photographs that the Red Guards would have destroyed. They kept alive, in whatever way they could, the things that the revolution wanted them to abandon. A woman in Shanghai in 1968, hiding her grandmother's jade bracelet in a cavity behind the kitchen tiles, was performing an act of preservation that was also an act of love and an act of resistance. Not grand resistance, not heroic resistance, but the small, stubborn, unkillable resistance of a person who knows that not everything should be destroyed. Poland had a communist daily life that was, from the very beginning, complicated by the particular Polish relationship to history and religion and the Russian neighbour to the east. Poland had been partitioned, occupied, devastated by 2 world wars, and reduced to near annihilation. It had also been, for centuries, deeply Catholic, and the Catholic Church proved to be one of the few institutions that communist power could not simply dissolve, because its roots in Polish identity went too deep, and the attempt to eradicate it was more likely to produce resistance than compliance. The Polish Catholic Church became, under communist rule, a kind of alternative public sphere, a space where things could be said that could not be said elsewhere, where a version of Polish history could be maintained that differed from the official communist version, where community could be built around an identity that was not reducible to loyalty to the party. The election of Karol Wojtyła as Pope John Paul II in 1978 was experienced by Poles as something seismic, a validation of Polish identity and Catholic faith at the highest possible level, a moment of extraordinary collective emotion that the communist government was quite at a loss to manage. The Solidarity movement that emerged in 1980, led by the electrician Lech Walesa from the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, was the product of decades of Polish daily life under communism, of the particular resilience and stubbornness that this experience had produced, of the networks of mutual trust that had been maintained through the church and through informal community bonds, of the accumulated frustration of a people who had never entirely accepted the system imposed on them. When the shipyard workers went on strike and listed their 21 demands, including the right to form independent trade unions, the right to strike, freedom of expression, access to the mass media, they were not engaging in abstract ideological argument. They were listing the specific ways in which their daily lives had been made worse than they needed to be. The martial law imposed by General Jaruzelski in December 1981, which suspended Solidarity and imprisoned its leaders, imposed curfews and censorship, and sent tanks into the streets of Polish cities, was another chapter in the long story of communist power meeting the stubbornness of people who had decided they had had enough. It was not the end of the story. The story's end, which came in 1989, would be one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in modern history. Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu represented communist daily life at its most extreme. Ceausescu, who came to power in 1965 and ruled until his execution on Christmas Day 1989, created a system of personal tyranny that went beyond even the Soviet model in its intrusiveness and its irrationality. His austerity programs of the 1980s, driven by an obsessive desire to pay off Romania's foreign debt, stripped the population of basic necessities in ways that had no parallel elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Electricity was rationed. Buildings were heated to temperatures that barely kept pipes from freezing. Food was exported while Romanians queued for hours to buy the minimum needed for survival. Even typewriters had to be registered with the police, because a typewriter was an instrument that could produce anti-state documents. The Securitate, Romania's secret police, was pervasive. Informers were everywhere. The psychological climate of fear in Romania in the 1980s was, by the accounts of those who lived through it, unlike anything in the rest of the communist world at that time, and yet life continued. Romanians made their dinners in cold kitchens and kept each other warm with stories and kept alive, in the frozen privacy of their own minds, the belief that this could not go on forever. In Cuba, which presents perhaps the most controversial case study, controversial because the Cuban Revolution maintained, unlike most of its counterparts, a genuine base of popular support in substantial sections of the population. Daily life under communist rule had its own particular Caribbean character. The literacy campaign of 1961, which sent 250,000 young people and adults into the countryside to teach reading and writing, genuinely transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Cubans and was experienced by many participants as a moment of authentic social solidarity. The healthcare system, whatever its political context, genuinely improved health outcomes for the majority of the population. Life expectancy rose, infant mortality fell, but the Cuban economy, strangled partly by the United States embargo and partly by the inefficiencies of central planning, was unable to provide the abundance that the revolution had promised. The ration book, the libreta, governed access to basic food from 1962 onward, a system that was still in operation decades later. The restrictions on political expression, on freedom of movement, on access to information, were as real in Havana as in Moscow, if perhaps administered with less of the grey bureaucratic grimness and more of the Caribbean volatility that characterized everything else in Cuban life. The musicians and the baseball players and the dancers of Cuba lived inside this system, producing art and sport of extraordinary quality that sometimes seemed almost perversely at odds with the material conditions of the society that produced them. The streets of Havana had a particular quality that many visitors noted, a kind of vivid, improvised aliveness that the system had not managed to suppress, a beauty maintained not by the system but despite it, in the crumbling grandeur of the colonial architecture and the music that came from every open window and the conversations that spilled from doorsteps onto the warm evening streets. The experience of youth specifically, of growing up under communist rule, deserves its own extended attention. Children in communist countries did not know they were growing up under a particular kind of regime, any more than children anywhere know the specific character of the world they're growing up in. They knew the world they could see and touch and smell, and much of that world, for most children in most communist countries at most times, was not dramatically different from the world of childhood anywhere. There were playgrounds and football games and friendships formed in school corridors, and the particular intensity of adolescent first love. There were summer holidays at the seaside, the Black Sea coast for Soviet and Eastern European families, Varadero Beach for Cubans, where the state provided sanatoriums and holiday camps that offered ordinary working families access to the sea and the sun. There were birthday parties with cakes made from whatever ingredients were available, improvised with great ingenuity and presented with great love. There was the exquisite boredom of Sunday afternoons in small apartments, and the particular way that boredom eventually tips into invention. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 erupted from exactly this texture of daily life, from the accumulated frustrations and humiliations of daily life under a particularly rigid and Soviet-imposed communist regime. It began with students marching in Budapest, with a list of demands that included free elections, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and freedom of the press. Within days it had turned into a full-scale armed uprising, with Hungarian workers and soldiers joining the students, fighting in the streets of Budapest against the Soviet tanks that were eventually sent to suppress them. The revolution was crushed. Perhaps 3,000 Hungarians died in the fighting. 200,000 fled the country as refugees. But it left behind it a changed society, a Hungarian communist regime that, chastened by the experience, adopted what became known as goulash communism, a more relaxed, economically pragmatic version of communist rule that gave Hungarians a slightly higher standard of living and slightly more social latitude than most of their Eastern Bloc neighbours. By the 1970s and 80s, Hungary had the most liberal communist system in Eastern Europe, which was not saying very much but was something. The Prague Spring of 1968 was perhaps the most poignant episode in the history of communist daily life. The brief, extraordinary moment when Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček tried to build what was called socialism with a human face, a version of communism that would have free expression and free assembly and a genuine multi-party political system that would be socialist in its economics but democratic in its politics. In those months of early 1968, the Czech and Slovak people experienced something intoxicating: the sudden freedom to say what they actually thought, the explosion of repressed creativity, the sense that the gap between the official world and the private world might actually close. The Soviet invasion in August 1968, Operation Danube, coordinated with the armies of Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary and East Germany, ended the experiment. 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops entered Czechoslovakia in a single night. Alexander Dubček was taken to Moscow, humiliated, and eventually removed from power. The period that followed, called normalization, was a systematic reversal of all the spring's reforms, a grey blanket drawn back over the brief brightness. For those who had lived through the spring and the invasion, the normalization years were a particular kind of grief, the grief of something genuinely lost, something genuinely believed in, something that had been real and had been taken away. The Charter 77 movement that emerged in Czechoslovakia in the late 1970s was one of the most intellectually distinguished dissident movements in the communist world. The playwright Václav Havel, who would eventually become the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia, wrote about the experience of living under communist rule with a philosophical precision that has rarely been equalled. His essay, The Power of the Powerless, written in 1978, analysed the phenomenon of the greengrocer who puts a "Workers of the World Unite" sign in his shop window, not because he believes it, not because he is trying to persuade anyone of anything, but because it is expected of him, because not doing it would be conspicuous and potentially dangerous, because it is simply part of the performance of daily life under communist rule. The greengrocer's sign, Havel argued, was not propaganda. It was a ritual of conformity, a demonstration of submission, and its ubiquity was more frightening than any overt propaganda campaign. Havel's insight points to something profound about the nature of communist daily life that we should hold on to as we near the end of our long journey tonight. The system did not primarily work by force, though force was always in the background. It worked by making conformity the path of least resistance, by making each small act of compliance seem too small to matter, by making resistance seem both futile and dangerous. It worked by gradually normalizing the abnormal, by making the performance of loyalty feel like simply the way things were done. And in doing so, it implicated ordinary people in its own perpetuation, not as enthusiastic supporters but as reluctant participants, people who put up the sign not because they believed in it, but because they did not, on that particular day, have the energy or the will or the confidence to refuse. This is the most uncomfortable truth of daily life under communist rule, and perhaps the most important one. The system was maintained not primarily by the secret police and the informers and the labour camps, terrible as these were. It was maintained by the millions of daily acts of small compliance that ordinary people performed, putting up the sign, attending the meeting, saying the right thing at the right moment, not because they were true believers, but because they were people with children and jobs and apartments, and the ordinary human need to get through the day without catastrophe. North Korea represents the most extreme continuation of this logic into the present day. What daily life is like in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the 21st century is knowable only partially, through the accounts of defectors and the observations of the very few foreigners permitted inside. But what those accounts suggest is a daily life shaped by all the features we have explored tonight: the surveillance, the propaganda, the shortage economy, the mandatory performance of loyalty, intensified to a degree that has no precedent elsewhere. The personality cult of the Kim family, now in its third generation, demands a performance of devotion that goes beyond anything required even in the Stalinist Soviet Union. The restrictions on information are almost total. The punishment for deviation is catastrophic. And inside this system, as inside all the others, people are living lives that are at their core fully human, loving their children, finding small pleasures, carving out whatever private space is available, enduring. The fall of European communism in 1989, the year of extraordinary events when the Berlin Wall came down and Solidarity formed a government in Poland, and Václav Havel was elected president of Czechoslovakia and the Ceausescus were executed in Romania, and the world watched with a collective incredulity at the speed with which something that had seemed permanent simply dissolved, was not experienced uniformly or simply. For some it was pure liberation, pure joy, the end of something that had been oppressive and false, and that was finally over. For others, particularly those who had built their identities within the system, or who had depended on its social guarantees, it was genuinely frightening. The destruction of everything familiar, the sudden exposure to a kind of freedom that came without safety nets or certainties. And for many it was both at once. The joy and the fear mixed together in proportions that varied from person to person and from day to day, a complex emotional response to the end of the world they had known, for better and worse, all their lives. The post-communist world discovered very quickly that the legacies of decades of communist daily life did not simply dissolve with the regimes that had produced them. The habits of mind formed under surveillance, the wariness, the careful speech, the distrust of official institutions persisted. The social networks of mutual obligation and exchange that had developed in place of the market continued to shape economic and social life. The buildings were still there, the grey apartment blocks, the Khrushchevkas, the identical windows. The people who had lived in them were still there. The stories were still there, in them, waiting to be told. There is something that happens when you spend a long time living inside another era, really trying to understand it from within, when you set aside the simple narrative of good and evil and try to see instead the full, human texture of a time and place. You begin to notice the things that don't fit the simple narrative. You begin to notice the geraniums. Communist rule in the 20th century was responsible for some of the greatest crimes in human history. The famines, the purges, the labour camps, the suppression of entire peoples, the systematic destruction of truth and freedom and human dignity across decades and continents. These are not things to be minimized or excused or forgotten. They were real. They cost real lives and caused real suffering on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. And they happened to real people, not abstractions, not statistics, but people who had names and faces and habits and the same range of feelings that we have. The woman standing in the snow outside the bread shop in Moscow in 1937, not knowing whether her husband, who was arrested last week, is alive or dead, is not an abstraction. She is as real as we are, and her fear and her love and her terrible patience are as real as anything we will ever experience. What communist rule teaches us, among other things, is something about the relationship between systems and people, about how people are shaped by the systems they live within, and how they also shape those systems, how they resist them and accommodate them and transform them and are transformed by them. The system was powerful, but it was never all-powerful. The person was constrained, but never entirely. The gap between the system and the self was never completely closed, and in that gap, life continued. Real, warm, funny, grieving, stubborn, endlessly resourceful life. There is also something to be learned from the contrast between what communist rule promised and what it delivered, not as a simple lesson in the superiority of one system over another, but as a more complex reflection on the difficulty of human organization, on the way that noble intentions can produce terrible outcomes when combined with concentrated power and the suppression of criticism, on the importance of the institutions, the free press, the independent judiciary, the genuine political opposition, that communist rule eliminated and whose absence it turned out mattered enormously. The promise of a world without exploitation, a world of genuine equality, a world where the basic needs of every person were met. These things are not nothing. They spoke to real injustices in the world as it was, and they speak to real injustices in the world as it continues to be. The failure to achieve them through communist means does not make the aspirations wrong. It makes the world more complicated, more resistant to simple solutions, more demanding of the patient, imperfect, contested, and always incomplete work of making things better. In the city of Kiev in the 1970s, a market known as the Tolkuchka, the word means roughly the pushing place, a reference to the crowds, operated every Sunday morning in a large open lot near one of the outer metro stations. Officially, it was a flea market where individuals could sell used personal belongings. In practice, it was a thriving informal economy where you could buy jeans imported by sailors or diplomatic staff, Western cassette tapes, foreign cigarettes, spare parts for Zhiguli automobiles, religious icons, old coins, medical supplies, and almost anything else that was either scarce in the official system or simply unavailable. The prices were in rubles, but the psychology was capitalist. Supply and demand, negotiation, the meeting of a willing seller and a willing buyer without the intervention of the state planning apparatus. The vendors at the Tolkuchka were remarkably varied. There were pensioners selling off pieces of a lifetime's accumulation to supplement inadequate pensions. There were young men who had somehow acquired desirable goods through connections in the port or the customs service. There were engineers and teachers and factory workers selling things they no longer needed or had produced with their own hands, handmade wooden toys, embroidered linens, jars of honey from a private beehive. And there were the professional speculators, the fartsovshchiki, who made their living from the differential between the official economy and the black market, buying low in one sphere and selling high in the other, living in a permanent state of low-level illegality and considerable prosperity. The fartsovshchiki occupied an interesting social position. They were criminals in the technical sense. Speculation was a crime in the Soviet Union, and the penalties could be severe, including imprisonment. But they were also providers of genuine value in a system that routinely failed to provide what people wanted. The young man who could get you a pair of Levi's jeans or a Rolling Stones album or a bottle of real Scotch whiskey was not seen by most of his customers as a criminal. He was seen as someone who had solved a problem that the state had refused to solve. The jeans question is worth lingering on because it illustrates something important about the cultural politics of daily life under communist rule. Western jeans, and it was specifically Western jeans, not the Soviet-produced equivalents, which existed but were widely regarded as inferior, became one of the most powerful symbols of the gap between official culture and popular desire. The official culture regarded Western jeans as a symbol of cultural imperialism, decadent capitalism's effort to corrupt socialist youth through the seduction of consumer goods. The youth regarded them as simply very desirable clothing that they wanted to wear. The gap between these two positions was itself a political statement, though most of those wearing contraband jeans would not have described it in those terms. They just wanted to look the way they wanted to look. The smuggling of cultural products, music especially, had a similar quality. Western rock music was officially disapproved of in most communist countries for most of the period of communist rule. It was associated with Western decadence, with a counterculture that was fundamentally at odds with the values of socialist collectivism, and it was enormously popular. Soviet youth of the 1970s and 80s consumed Western music with an appetite that the official culture found deeply frustrating. The Beatles were heard everywhere, on officially smuggled cassette tapes, on copies that degraded in quality with each generation, but retained their essential appeal, on contraband vinyl records that circulated from hand to hand with the careful reverence of religious texts. The Soviet rock scene that developed in response was one of the most interesting cultural phenomena of the late Soviet period. Soviet rock bands, operating officially in the youth cultural centers, semi-officially through the underground concert circuit, and illegally through self-recorded cassette tapes that circulated through the same networks as foreign music, produced genuinely remarkable music. The Leningrad band Aquarium, led by the poet-musician Boris Grebenshchikov, developed a sound and a lyrical sensibility that was entirely its own, clearly influenced by Western rock but transformed by the Russian tradition and the specific conditions of Soviet life into something that could only have come from where it came from. The Soviet cultural underground, the samizdat world of self-published literature, the magnetizdat world of self-recorded music, the underground art shows held in private apartments, was a genuinely alternative culture, a shadow culture that operated in the gaps left by the official culture. It was not primarily political, though it existed in permanent tension with the political. It was primarily artistic, driven by the need to say things and make things that the official channels would not permit, by the conviction that truth-telling was worth the risk it entailed. Let us spend a little more time with the experience of women, because it is impossible to fully understand daily life under communist rule without attending carefully to the lives of the women who lived it. Women were the backbone of the communist economy in the most literal sense. They worked in the factories and the hospitals and the schools and the laboratories, and they maintained the households, and they stood in the queues, and they kept the family networks together, and they did all of this simultaneously without complaint, or rather with complaint, but complaint that the system gave them no effective mechanism to act upon. The double burden was real and it was heavy. A study conducted in the Soviet Union in the 1970s found that Soviet women worked on average roughly twice as many hours per week on domestic tasks as Soviet men: cooking, cleaning, shopping, childcare, care of elderly relatives, on top of their full-time employment. This was not dramatically different from the situation of women in the capitalist West at the same period, but it was exacerbated by the specific conditions of the Soviet economy: the queues, the unreliable supply of basic goods, the absence of many of the labor-saving devices and convenience foods that were beginning to transform domestic work in Western countries. Soviet women had access to abortion. Indeed, Soviet Russia was the first country in the world to legalize abortion in 1920. The right was revoked under Stalin in 1936 and restored after his death in 1955. In the absence of reliable contraception, which was poorly available in the Soviet Union for most of its history, abortion became the primary means of family planning. Soviet women underwent on average 3 to 5 abortions in their lifetime, a figure that reflects both the inadequacy of contraceptive provision and the genuine agency that women exercised over their reproductive choices within the constraints available to them. The relationship between official communist ideology and gender was full of tensions that were never fully resolved. The ideology said that women were equal, that the liberation of women from domestic servitude was one of the revolution's achievements. The reality was that gender inequality persisted in new forms. Women were overrepresented in lower-paid sectors like medicine and education, underrepresented in the higher levels of party and state power, and expected to combine professional work with the full weight of domestic responsibility. The occasional woman who rose to a position of real power in the Soviet system, and there were some, though they remained exceptional, typically did so by conforming to the male norms of the political culture rather than by transforming those norms. And yet women also found, within these constraints, real power and real agency. The grandmother, the babushka, occupied a position in Soviet and Eastern European family life that was both practically essential and culturally central. With both parents working full-time, it was typically the grandmother who provided childcare, who maintained the household, who managed the logistics of food and clothing, and the 1,000 small requirements of daily life. The babushka who could navigate the queue system, who knew which shops were likely to have what on which days, who had relationships with every important local official. The woman at the bakery, the doctor at the neighborhood clinic, the person who assigned places in the summer pioneer camp, was a figure of genuine power, even if that power was entirely unofficial. The friendships between women, formed in the workplace, in the queue, in the communal apartment, in the apartment building's shared stairwell, were another form of informal power. Women shared information, what was available where, which doctor was reliable, which official was approachable, how to navigate a particular bureaucratic requirement. They pooled resources, lending money, sharing childcare, exchanging food, providing practical and emotional support through the crises that the system reliably produced. These networks of female friendship and mutual aid were, in a very real sense, one of the things that held communist daily life together. The Soviet polyclinic, the neighborhood health center that was the primary point of contact between ordinary citizens and the healthcare system, was a building you came to know very well if you lived in any Soviet city. It served a defined catchment area, and every person within that area was assigned to it. You did not choose your doctor. You went to the polyclinic. You took a numbered ticket from the dispenser in the lobby. You sat in a waiting room that was typically equipped with rows of wooden chairs and a poster about the importance of hand washing, and you waited for your number to be called. The wait could be very long. Polyclinics were chronically understaffed, and the appointment system was often nominal. In practice, it was first come, first serve for the morning or afternoon session, and if your problem was not urgent enough to qualify for an emergency appointment, you simply waited as long as the waiting took. Patients brought knitting or books. They talked to each other. They shared cigarettes. Smoking in the waiting room of a Soviet polyclinic was not, for most of the period, considered unusual. The doctors in the polyclinics were mostly women. Soviet medicine, like Soviet education, was a feminist profession, well-trained and technically capable, but poorly paid relative to the prestige it might have commanded in other systems. A Soviet physician earned less than a Soviet factory worker, one of the more striking inversions of the usual professional hierarchy. The doctor who saw you after your long wait was likely tired and overworked, and dealing with resources that were frequently inadequate. She might not have the medicine you needed. She might have to refer you to a specialist, and the wait for the specialist would begin. The Soviet system of mental health care is worth examining because it illuminates something important and disturbing about the relationship between medicine and political power in a communist state. The Soviet psychiatric system developed, particularly under Brezhnev, the practice of incarcerating political dissidents in psychiatric hospitals, psychiatry, on diagnoses of invented mental illnesses. The most notorious of these was sluggish schizophrenia, a condition unique to Soviet psychiatry, defined as a form of schizophrenia in which the symptoms were not the obvious psychotic features that Western psychiatry associated with the diagnosis, but rather subtle abnormalities of thinking, such as the belief that one's society was unjust or the conviction that one's opinions were more valid than those of the state. The person who believed the Soviet system was wrong was, by definition, exhibiting disordered thinking, because the Soviet system was not wrong, and therefore no rational person could sincerely believe it was. This was not a widespread practice. The total number of people subjected to psychiatric internment for political reasons, while significant, was much smaller than the numbers subjected to imprisonment in the labour camps. But it was deeply illuminating. It revealed the logic of a system that could not, within its own framework, acknowledge the legitimacy of dissent. If the party was always right, then those who opposed the party were always wrong, and if they were sincere in their opposition, truly convinced rather than simply venal or self-interested, then there must be something wrong with their minds. The psychiatrization of dissent was the ideological logic carried to its clinical conclusion. Let us go deeper into the life of the collective farm, because it is one of the places where the gap between communist promise and communist reality was most visible, and also one of the places where human ingenuity most clearly triumphed over systemic failure. The kolkhoz of the 1950s and 60s was not the enthusiastic collective of the propaganda posters. It was a complex, often dysfunctional institution that the people working in it had learned to navigate with great creativity. The fundamental problem of the kolkhoz was incentive. When the produce of the collective fields belonged to the collective, which meant, in practice, to the state, since the state set the procurement prices and took what it needed before anything was distributed to the farmers, there was limited individual incentive to maximize production. The rational calculation of the collective farmer was straightforward. Work hard enough to avoid punishment, but not so hard as to set expectations that you would then be required to meet every year. Save your real energy and ingenuity for the private plot, where the fruits of your labour were genuinely your own. The result was an agricultural system that consistently underperformed its enormous potential. The Soviet Union had vast areas of fertile land, the Ukrainian steppe, the Cuban lowlands, the Volga River basin, that under different management might have made it one of the world's leading agricultural exporters. Instead, it became one of the world's largest importers of grain, forced in the 1970s to buy hundreds of millions of tons of wheat from the United States and Canada, the Great American Grain Deal of 1972, which Nixon concluded with Brezhnev in an episode of Cold War pragmatism that neither side wished to publicize. In the villages of rural Russia, rural Ukraine, rural Central Asia, daily life on the collective farm had a quality that mixed genuine poverty with the particular human richness of a community that had known the same ground for generations. The Russian village, the derevnya, had its own social world, its own gossip and feuds and celebrations, its own relationship to the natural rhythms of planting and harvest that persisted beneath the imposed rhythms of the kolkhoz work schedule. The village church, even if it had been converted to a grain store or a clubhouse, was still there, its shape part of the landscape. The cemetery was still there, with the graves of people whose names were still known. The village grandmother who had survived collectivization, who had seen the requisitioning squads come through in 1930 and 1931, who had buried children who starved in the famine years, who had watched the men go off to the war in 1941 and waited for the ones who did not come back, was a repository of a history that the state had done its best to suppress. She knew what the land had been before it became collective. She remembered the names of the kulaks, the richer peasants who'd been deported or shot in the collectivization drive. Names that were not supposed to be spoken, names that had been erased from the official record but that lived on in private memory. She was 65 or 70 years old, and she had seen things that would fill many books, and she kept them safe inside her, and she passed on what she could to whoever would listen. The harvest season had its own drama. When it was time to bring in the grain, the entire rural population mobilized. Not just the kolkhoz farmers, but teachers and students and factory workers bussed in from the cities to help with the harvest, a practice that persisted throughout the Soviet period and that was experienced by the urban participants with a mixture of grumbling and genuine enjoyment of the outdoor physical work in the countryside. The harvest was a race against the weather, and the weather did not respect the planning timetables of the state agricultural ministry. Autumn in the collective farm village had a particular smell, the smell of turned earth and threshed grain, and the smoke of burning stubble and the first cold nights. Women made preserves from the produce of private plots, jars of pickled cucumbers, jars of tomatoes in their own juice, jars of mushrooms gathered from the forest in the brief autumn window, jars of jam from the currants and gooseberries of the kitchen garden. The cellar below the house filled up with these reserves, and the fullness of the cellar was a measure of security, of the family's ability to see out the winter without depending entirely on what the cooperative grocery might or might not have on its shelves. Animals kept on the private plot were a source of food and income that was carefully managed and fiercely protected. A cow, where private cow ownership was permitted, was an extraordinary asset. A cow meant milk and butter and smetana, the sour cream that was fundamental to Russian cooking. It meant the possibility of a small income from selling dairy products at the collective farm market. It meant work, feeding and milking twice a day, every day without exception. The relentless rhythm of animal care that organized the day around the animal's needs as much as the farmer's. The cow was treated with something close to reverence, because the cow was the difference between adequacy and hardship. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, presents a case study in communist daily life that has been unusually well documented, partly because of the extraordinary quantity of records left by the Stasi, and partly because the reunification of Germany in 1990 brought together people from two societies that shared a language and a history but had lived very differently for 4 decades, and the encounter between their different experiences produced a great deal of testimony on both sides. The East German experience is in some ways the most psychologically complex in the communist world, precisely because it was so thoroughly documented. We know from the Stasi archives open after reunification not just that surveillance happened, but the exact texture of how it happened. The specific words used in informer reports, the exact nature of the Zersetzung operations against specific individuals, the extraordinary detail with which the state had tracked the lives of its citizens. Reading these archives is a peculiarly intimate experience, like finding someone's diary, except that the diary was kept by the state about a person who did not know she was being observed. One of the most remarkable things revealed by the Stasi archives is the sheer ordinariness of the surveillance. The informer reports are full of the trivial details of daily life: who visited whom, what was served for dinner, what jokes were told, what the weather was like. The surveillance was not just of the obviously political, but of the comprehensively human. The state wanted to know not just what its citizens thought about politics, but how they spent their Sundays, what films they preferred, who they were sleeping with, what they dreamed about. Ostalgie, the German portmanteau of Ost, East, and nostalgia, is the phenomenon that emerged in the years after reunification, as many East Germans found themselves feeling a complex, often contradictory longing for aspects of their life under communism. This was not, in most cases, nostalgia for the political system. Few serious people missed the Stasi or the Berlin Wall, or the restrictions on travel and expression. It was nostalgia for a particular texture of daily life, for the slower pace, for the security of employment and housing, for the Spreewaldgurken, the pickled gherkins that were a GDR speciality, for the particular atmosphere of a society that, for all its repressiveness, had a kind of warmth in its smaller human moments. The shopping experience in the GDR, while better than in many communist countries, had its own frustrations that are remembered with retrospective affection. The Kaufhalle, the state supermarket, had a particular atmosphere, not quite the drab uniformity of Soviet shops, but not the abundance of Western supermarkets either. There were products that were associated specifically with the GDR that became, after reunification, objects of affection and identity. The Rotkäppchen sparkling wine, the Vita Cola, the Club Cola, the Spee laundry detergent. These products, which had existed because they were what the state had produced, became after reunification symbols of a lost world and were sought out by those who had grown up with them. The Trabant, the small, famously unreliable two-stroke engine car that was the primary private vehicle of East German daily life, is perhaps the most famous of these East German products. You had to wait years for a Trabant. The waiting list was typically 10 to 12 years, and you applied for your place on the list when you wanted to eventually own a car, not when you actually needed one. The Trabant was made partly of a plastic compound called Duraplast, a material reinforced with cotton or wool fibres that was, crucially, not recyclable, a fact that created significant problems in the post-reunification period when millions of Trabants were suddenly abandoned. It was small, noisy, and slow. It was also, for its owners, beloved, the object of an intense attachment that came from the years of waiting and the reality that it was the only car most East Germans would ever own. In the years of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's catastrophic program of rapid industrialization and collectivization, launched in 1958, the daily life of hundreds of millions of Chinese people was disrupted and distorted to a degree that is difficult to comprehend. The program, which aimed to transform China from an agrarian society to an industrial and communist society within a generation, was based on deeply flawed economic assumptions and was implemented with a recklessness and a disregard for human life that produced the worst famine in recorded history. At the level of daily life, the Great Leap Forward meant the formation of people's communes, massive agricultural units that merged together dozens or hundreds of previously separate villages and collective farms into single administrative units, with populations of tens of thousands. In the communes, private life was further collectivized than it had been. Communal dining halls were established where everyone ate together. The private kitchen was, in some versions of the program, to be abolished entirely because cooking at home was inefficient. The grain and other food that the communes produced was requisitioned by the state at quotas that were based not on what was actually being produced, but on what local officials had reported, and officials, under intense pressure to show that the Great Leap Forward was succeeding, routinely reported yields that were wildly exaggerated. The consequence was that grain was taken from villages that did not have enough to feed their own people, taken to meet quotas based on production figures that existed only in the reports of frightened officials, and the villages were left with nothing. People died in their millions, quietly, in small villages across the Chinese countryside, in a famine that the government did not acknowledge and that the world at large did not know about for decades. The death toll was somewhere between 30 and 45 million people, a figure so large it resists comprehension. After the Great Leap Forward came the Cultural Revolution, and the daily experience of this period was of a different kind. Less the passivity of starvation than the terrible energy of mobilized violence. The Red Guards, young people, many of them teenagers, given license to attack the Four Olds, moved through the cities and towns of China, destroying everything associated with the pre-revolutionary past. They entered homes and demanded the surrender of books, artworks, musical instruments, religious objects, family photographs showing pre-revolutionary dress or customs. They held struggle sessions against teachers, professors, intellectuals, party officials who were suddenly accused of counter-revolutionary tendencies. What it felt like to live through this from the inside has been described by many people who survived it, and subsequently wrote memoirs or gave interviews. The sense of unreality was pervasive. Yesterday, the teacher who'd been respected and admired for decades was suddenly a class enemy to be denounced by the very students she had taught. Yesterday, the books on the shelf were education. Today, they were evidence of bourgeois contamination. Yesterday, the instruments of rational thought, evidence, argument, expertise, had authority. Today, the quotations of Mao Zedong from the Little Red Book were the only authority that mattered, and no counter-argument could be made. The Little Red Book itself, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, was one of the most remarkable physical objects in the history of communist daily life. Printed in the billions, it was carried by everyone in China during the Cultural Revolution, displayed prominently, read from in meetings, waved in demonstrations. Its quotations were brief and frequently applicable to any situation, which made them remarkably versatile as rhetorical instruments. They could be used to support almost any position, because they were sufficiently numerous and sufficiently general that anyone seeking a relevant quotation could find one. This was not an accident. The book was designed to provide a substitute for rational argument, a vocabulary of authority that could be invoked without the need for the kind of reasoning that might lead somewhere inconvenient. The people who survived the Cultural Revolution, and the vast majority did survive it, despite the hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions who were killed or who died in the chaos, emerged from it changed in ways that took decades to fully manifest. The trust in institutions, the respect for expertise, the commitment to education and culture that had been building in China since the Communist Revolution of 1949, all of these had been severely damaged. A generation of young people had been used as instruments of political violence, and had then been sent down to the countryside in the educated youth movement, the Xiaxiang movement, where they spent years in rural poverty and labour that bore no relationship to any future they had imagined for themselves. Mirek was 22 years old in 1968 and worked as a mechanic in a Prague factory. He had been a pioneer, had joined the Communist Youth Union, had studied his political education materials with the same diligence he applied to everything else. Not out of conviction, exactly, but because it was simply what you did, what the context required, what the young men around him were doing. He was interested in football and in jazz, which he listened to on the radio when the signal was good, and in a girl named Jana who worked in the same factory and who had a way of smiling at him that made it difficult to concentrate on the carburetor he was supposed to be adjusting. The Prague Spring of 1968 was, for Mirek, an extraordinary experience, not primarily political but human. It was the experience of a world suddenly becoming more frank, more open, more like the private world he'd always kept inside himself. The newspaper he had read every morning with his breakfast, dutifully as part of the texture of daily routine, suddenly contained things that surprised him, things that corresponded to what he actually thought, rather than to what he was supposed to think. There were debates in the streets. People talked to strangers about things that mattered. At the factory, the political meetings became real discussions rather than ritual performances. He cannot have known in those months that it would end so quickly. He cannot have known that on the night of August 20th to 21st, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops would cross into Czechoslovakia in a single night, and that by morning his country would be occupied and the spring would be over. He found out in the early hours of that morning when the radio began playing the national anthem on a loop, the signal established in advance for exactly this contingency, that invasion had come. He went outside. The streets of Prague were full of people, silent, looking at the tanks. He and Jana stood together on the pavement in the early morning light and held hands and did not speak because there was nothing to say. He did not leave. 200,000 Czechoslovaks did leave in the weeks and months following the invasion, taking advantage of the brief window before the borders closed to build new lives in Austria or West Germany or further afield. Mirek stayed. His parents were here, his friends were here, Jana was here. He stayed and he went back to the factory and he attended the renewed political meetings, and he said what was expected and he went on with his life, which was smaller now than it had been in the spring but was still his life. He and Jana married in 1970. They got on the apartment waiting list. They were assigned an apartment in one of the new panel buildings in a suburb of Prague in 1973, 3 years after they'd applied, which was considered quite fast. The apartment had 2 rooms and a kitchen and a bathroom with a combination bathtub and shower that worked well when the water pressure was adequate. They painted the walls a warm yellow. Jana made curtains from fabric she bought at the cooperative. They put up bookshelves. They began, slowly and carefully, to make it home. Years later, decades later, Mirek's daughter, born in 1975 and named after Jana's grandmother, would ask him what it had been like. He would think for a while before answering. It was life, he would say eventually, a constrained life. But life. He would pause. The spring was real, he would add, and she could hear in his voice something she could not quite name. Not nostalgia exactly, not grief exactly, but the particular quality of a memory that has been held carefully for a very long time. Food under communist rule deserves its own extended meditation, because it was so central to the daily experience. So much of the energy and creativity and social intelligence of ordinary people was devoted to the question of food, to getting it, preparing it, preserving it, sharing it, and finding in it one of the few domains of genuine personal expression and pleasure that the system did not entirely control. Soviet cuisine, to the extent that such a thing can be spoken of as a unity, was a vast and rich tradition that the communist system simultaneously celebrated in its propaganda and undermined in its economics. The Soviet system of food production and distribution consistently failed to provide the variety and quality of food that the population wanted. but it did not prevent people from cooking with great skill and inventiveness what was available to them. The fundamental ingredients of Soviet daily cooking were limited and repetitive, but not without their own logic and richness. Black bread, dense, slightly sour, made from rye, the bread of the Russian and Eastern European tradition, was the foundation of every meal. Buckwheat kasha was the standard breakfast and also appeared in other contexts. Borscht, the great beet soup that is one of the most magnificent dishes in European cuisine, deeply savoury and earthy and sweet all at once, appeared in more variations than can easily be counted, each family maintaining its own recipe as a point of honour and identity. Solyanka, the hearty meat and vegetable soup with its characteristic sour-salty combination, was a staple. Pelmeni, small meat dumplings similar to ravioli, were made in large batches on winter evenings. The family gathered around the kitchen table rolling dough and stuffing dumplings in an assembly line process that was also a social ritual. The smetana, the cultured sour cream that appeared in everything, was one of the great condiments of Soviet cuisine, a way of enriching and rounding out dishes that might otherwise be sparse. A spoonful of smetana on borscht, on buckwheat kasha, on a simple vegetable salad transformed the dish. When smetana was available in the shops, it was bought in quantity. When it was not, which was not infrequent, people made do. Making do was the great Soviet culinary art form. The cook who could take whatever happened to be available that day, a few onions, some potatoes, a tin of fish, some smetana, some of last summer's pickled cucumbers, and turn it into something genuinely good to eat, was exercising a skill that was valued and celebrated, a form of creativity that the system could not entirely suppress because it was precisely about working around the system's limitations. Soviet women's magazines, which were substantial publications full of recipes and household advice and fashion and health information alongside the mandatory political content, devoted enormous space to recipes designed for difficult conditions, recipes that used substitute ingredients, that made a little go a long way, that transformed the ordinary into something approaching the special. The New Year celebration, Novi God, was the greatest annual food event in Soviet domestic life. Christmas as a religious holiday had been suppressed, but the end-of-year celebration had survived and been officially sanctioned as a secular festival. In the weeks before Novi God, Soviet households mobilized all their networks and connections to obtain the ingredients for the celebration meal. The Olivier salad, a Russian version of potato salad with peas, pickles, hard-boiled eggs and mayonnaise, named after the French chef who'd created an earlier version in 19th century Moscow, was the centerpiece of virtually every Soviet New Year table, and its preparation was taken with great seriousness. Families had their own recipes, their own ratios and additions, and the quality of a family's Olivier was a matter of some pride. The mayonnaise for the Olivier, Provençal-style mayonnaise, produced by the state food industry and sold in jars, was itself an object of desire. A jar of Provençal mayonnaise appearing on the shelves of the cooperative grocery was something to be bought without hesitation, whether you needed it immediately or not, because next week it mightn't be there. Soviet shopping habits were shaped by this logic of the unexpected availability of desired goods. You bought what was there when it was there, regardless of your immediate needs, because there was no guarantee it would be there tomorrow. People maintained in their homes a stock of preserved and purchased goods that sometimes bore no immediate relationship to their culinary plans, but represented a calculated hedge against the unreliability of supply. The collective farm market was the place where the most direct exchange between producer and consumer took place, and it was also the place where the most vivid sensory impression of Soviet food culture could be obtained. The market halls of the major Soviet cities, particularly in Moscow and Leningrad, but also across the Republic capitals, were at their best genuinely extraordinary. Here were the products of the private plots and private livestock, sold by the people who had grown and raised them. The colours of the autumn market, the deep purple of eggplants, the scarlet of tomatoes, the orange of pumpkins, the white of garlic heads braided together in long ropes, were a visual abundance that contrasted sharply with the grey uniformity of the state shops. The prices at the collective farm market were higher than at the state shops. This was the whole point, the market reflecting something closer to actual supply and demand than the fixed prices of the state system. But the quality was generally better and the variety was genuinely greater, and those who could afford the market prices considered them worth paying. The sellers, typically older women from collective farms within reach of the city, women who had risen at 4 a.m. to load their produce onto the train, were shrewd negotiators who had learned to read the market with the accuracy of people whose livelihood depended on it. The relationship between art and communist power was one of the most consistently interesting and revealing aspects of daily life under communist rule, because it was one of the places where the tension between the system's demands and the human need for authentic expression was most visible and most creative in its resolutions. The Soviet film industry produced, under extraordinarily constrained conditions, some of the 20th century's most remarkable cinema. Directors like Andrei Tarkovsky, whose films Andrei Rublev, Solaris and The Mirror created a cinematic language of extraordinary richness and density, worked within the Soviet system for most of their careers, navigating the approval process, the censorship committees, the demands for ideological acceptability. Tarkovsky's films were barely tolerated, sometimes suppressed, sometimes released in limited prints, sometimes criticized as formalist and inaccessible. But they existed, and they were seen, and they had a profound effect on those who saw them. The experience of watching a Tarkovsky film in a Soviet cinema in the 1970s was not a passive entertainment. It was something more like a spiritual exercise, an act of attention and contemplation that the film demanded, and that the audience in the conditions of Soviet intellectual life was primed to provide. Soviet audiences were extraordinarily attentive cinema-goers. They had learned to read films closely, to attend to what was suggested as much as what was stated, to find in the gaps and silences of officially approved art the meanings that could not be placed there directly. Theatre was another site of extraordinary creativity within constraint. The Moscow Art Theatre, with its tradition going back to Stanislavski and Chekhov, maintained standards that were genuinely world-class. The Taganka Theatre under Yuri Lyubimov became, in the 1960s and 70s, one of the most exciting theatrical institutions in Europe. Productions that pushed at the edges of what was permitted, that used metaphor and theatrical invention to say things that could not be said directly, that attracted audiences who understood the game being played and appreciated the sophistication with which it was being played. Poetry occupied a special place in Russian cultural life under communism. The Russian tradition of regarding the poet as a moral authority, a speaker of truth in conditions that make truth-telling dangerous, goes back centuries and was intensified rather than diminished by the communist period. The poetry readings of the 1960s, the period of the thaw under Khrushchev, attracted enormous crowds. Yevgeny Yevtushenko and Andrei Voznesensky read to audiences of thousands in Moscow stadiums, their work expressing things about Soviet life that could not be expressed in prose, that the poetic form somehow permitted that the documentary form did not. The underground poetry of the post-Stalinist period, the work of Joseph Brodsky, of Bela Akhmadulina, of the poets who circulated their work in samizdat, typed and retyped by hand on tissue paper and passed from reader to reader, was the most honest art of the era, and it was produced at real personal cost. Brodsky was tried in 1964 for social parasitism, the charge being that he lived from his writing, which the state did not recognize as legitimate work. At his trial, the judge asked him who had authorized him to call himself a poet. He replied that he thought it came from God. He was sentenced to 5 years of internal exile in the Arkhangelsk region, working as a farm laborer. The transcript of his trial, secretly recorded and circulated in samizdat, became one of the most widely read documents of the era. The samizdat phenomenon, the self-publishing underground that circulated uncensored literature through hand-copying and informal distribution networks, was one of the most remarkable expressions of the human need for authentic communication in conditions that suppressed it. Samizdat texts range from literary works by established writers who could not publish officially, to political analysis and reportage, to religious texts, to the records of political trials, to translations of foreign works unavailable through official channels. The production and circulation of samizdat was illegal, and those who engaged in it risked prosecution. And yet it persisted throughout the communist period in Russia and Eastern Europe, a testimony to the strength of the need it served. The period immediately following the collapse of communist rule in 1989 and 1991 was, for the people who lived through it, one of the most disorienting and exhilarating and frightening experiences imaginable. Everything that had structured daily life, the system of employment, the system of housing, the system of food distribution, the system of social insurance, was suddenly dismantled, and in its place came a market economy that operated on entirely different principles and that most of the population had no experience of navigating. The transition was, for many people, genuinely terrible. Unemployment, which had been officially non-existent under communist rule, since the state guaranteed employment to everyone, even if the employment was frequently pointless, suddenly became a real phenomenon. Prices, which had been set by the state at artificially low levels, shot upward as they found their market levels. Savings accumulated over decades were wiped out by inflation. State enterprises that had been kept alive by subsidies closed, sometimes overnight, leaving entire cities without their main employer. The social guarantees that had been the system's most defensible achievement, the free health care, the subsidized housing, the guaranteed employment, eroded or collapsed under the pressure of the transition. For older people especially, those who had spent their working lives in the communist system and had built their expectations around its promises, the transition was a profound betrayal. Not of communism specifically, since many of them had no particular attachment to the ideology, but of the specific arrangements that had organized their lives. And yet, for others, particularly younger people with the adaptability and the appetite for risk that markets reward, the transition opened possibilities that would have been inconceivable under the old system. The entrepreneur who had always been frustrated by the constraints on private initiative could now open a business. The person who had always wanted to travel could now travel. The person who had longed to read the books that had been forbidden could now read them. The world that had seemed permanently fixed in its arrangements suddenly turned out to be changeable, and the change, however chaotic and painful, was evidence that nothing was permanent. The daily life of the post-communist transition, the overnight appearance of street markets, the proliferation of small private shops, the sudden visibility of advertising, which had been absent from the communist visual landscape, the arrival of Western goods in previously closed markets, the queues that persisted for a while out of habit before the market economy rendered them unnecessary, had a quality of almost hallucinatory novelty. People walked through their familiar streets and found them transformed. The cooperative grocery on the corner had become a private mini-market stocked with goods that would have seemed like fantasy a year before. The Marlboro cigarettes that had circulated on the black market were now available at any kiosk. The jeans that had required years of connection and negotiation were available at any market stall. The experience of suddenly having access to the abundance of the market, even before the incomes were there to take full advantage of it, was strange and powerful. Havel wrote about the experience of looking at the advertisement for a new brand of washing powder in the newly free Prague and feeling something between joy and bewilderment. The world that the system had presented as decadent and corrupting and inferior was now simply available, to be chosen or rejected on its merits. That freedom of choice, unremarkable to those who had always had it, was to those who had lived without it something genuinely extraordinary. There is a particular kind of patience that grows in people who stand in queues every day for decades. It is not the patience of passive resignation. It is something more active, more thoughtful, a trained skill of occupying the mind while the body waits. The queue was where you thought through problems. The queue was where you planned the week's meals, calculated the family budget, rehearsed the difficult conversation you needed to have with your supervisor. The queue was where you observed your fellow citizens with the sustained attention that proximity and shared boredom permits. Irina Mikhailovna, 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Leningrad who gave her account to an oral historian in the 1990s, remembered the queues not with bitterness but with a complex, careful accuracy. The worst queues, she said, were not the long ones. The worst were the ones where you did not know what you were queuing for. You would see a queue forming and join it, because if a queue was forming there must be something worth waiting for, and if you waited and there was nothing you had lost an hour, but if you did not wait and there was something good you had lost it forever, and you could not know which it would be until you reached the front. She paused in the recording, and you could almost hear in the silence the specific quality of that uncertainty. The Soviet queue as an existential condition, a daily confrontation with the unknowability of outcomes. The techniques for managing the queue had been refined over generations. There was the system of writing your name and number on your hand or on a piece of paper left in your place, so you could leave the queue briefly without losing your position, provided you returned within the understood time limit. There was the system of the representative, where one person from a group would stand in the queue for the whole group, with the understanding that the group would send someone to relieve the representative after a set time. There was the complex social policing of the queue itself, the vigilant monitoring of anyone who appeared to be jumping their place, the swift social sanction of public challenge that was remarkably effective. The experience of travelling on Soviet public transport had its own peculiar quality. The metro was magnificent, as we have noted, genuinely beautiful, genuinely efficient, genuinely cheap. But the surface transport, the buses and trolley buses and trams that served the areas not reached by the metro, was more complicated. Trams in particular were a Soviet institution that combined the genuine charm of a technology that felt both timeless and slightly improbable with the practical reality of overcrowding and unreliable schedules. A Soviet tram in winter, in a city like Novosibirsk or Krasnoyarsk, where the cold was genuinely extreme, was a study in collective endurance. Packed bodies generating their own warmth, the windows opaque with condensation, the floor slick with the snow tracked in from the street, the wheels grinding on tracks that had not been properly maintained since before the last major snowfall. People pressed together in the tram were simultaneously strangers and intimates, sharing breath and warmth and the particular smell of damp wool coats, and the cheap perfume that was available in the state shops. Old women demanded seats with a moral authority that brooked no argument. Young men gave up their seats or faced social disgrace. Children were passed over adult heads to reach the exits. Arguments broke out about queue jumping when the tram stopped and the crowd attempted to board. These were the small human dramas of daily life, repeated every morning and evening across 11 time zones and 4 decades, and they were real and vivid and full of the comedy and pathos of any close-packed human life. The communal apartment, the kommunalka, was one of the most distinctive institutions of Soviet urban life, particularly in the older cities like Moscow and Leningrad, where pre-revolutionary apartment buildings had been divided up and redistributed. A kommunalka was an apartment originally designed for a single bourgeois family, now shared by several families, each occupying 1 or 2 rooms while sharing the kitchen, bathroom and toilet. In some kommunalki, many families lived together, 5, 6, 7 different households, with their own furniture crowding the shared kitchen, their own schedules for using the bathroom, their own complicated social dynamics evolving over years and decades in the forced proximity of shared walls. The life of the kommunalka has been described by many of those who experienced it as simultaneously terrible and deeply formative. The privacy was minimal. You could hear everything through the walls and your neighbours could hear you. The negotiations over the shared kitchen were constant and sometimes bitter. Whose shelf in the refrigerator was whose, who had used whose saucepan, whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. The presence of others was inescapable, their habits and moods and domestic rhythms woven into the fabric of your own daily life whether you wished it or not. And yet the kommunalka also produced a kind of enforced community that many who lived in it came to value, or at least to appreciate retrospectively. The neighbour who became, over years of shared kitchen, a genuine friend. The elderly woman in the room at the end of the hall who was good with children, who told stories, who had seen extraordinary things and remembered them. The young couple in the room across the hall, whose happiness was audible through the wall, and which was, depending on your circumstances, either irritating or oddly comforting. Human beings are adaptable, and what is forced upon them they make their own, and the kommunalka was made by the people who lived in it into something richer and stranger, and more fully human than any set of housing policy regulations could have anticipated. The satellite states of the Soviet Union, the countries of the Eastern Bloc, experienced communism in ways that were shaped not just by the Soviet model imposed on them, but by their own histories, cultures, and political traditions. Understanding the differences between these experiences is important, because the category of life under communism can otherwise collapse into a false uniformity that obscures the real variety of the human experience it contained. Bulgaria, which had historical and cultural ties to Russia, going back to the 19th century and the liberation from Ottoman rule, had perhaps the most accepting relationship with the Soviet presence among the Eastern European communist states. The Bulgarian communist regime, under Todor Zhivkov, who held power from 1956 until the very end of communist rule in 1989, one of the longest-serving communist leaders in history, was authoritarian and repressive but not as dramatically cruel as some of its counterparts. Bulgarian daily life had a certain Mediterranean quality that distinguished it from the greyness often associated with the Eastern Bloc. The climate helped, as did a tradition of small-scale private agriculture and a food culture of genuine richness. The Bulgarian rose oil industry, producing a tar of roses used in perfumes worldwide, was one of the more charming features of Bulgarian communist economics. The Rose Valley near Kazanlak, where the damask rose had been cultivated for centuries, continued its production under communism, the roses harvested in the early morning by women and girls who moved through the pink mist of blossoms before the heat of the day could damage the petals. This was one of the corners of communist daily life where something genuinely lovely persisted beneath the ideological overlay. The beauty of the roses, the ancient craft of their distillation, the particular character of a valley that smelled like no other place on earth. Albania under Enver Hoxha represented perhaps the most extreme isolation of any European communist state. Hoxha, who ruled from 1944 until his death in 1985, pursued a policy of absolute autarky, self-sufficiency carried to the point of refusing aid from all potential providers, including eventually China, which had been Albania's last external supporter after the breaks with Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Albanian citizens were prohibited from owning private cars. They were prohibited from travelling abroad. They were prohibited from practicing religion. Albania declared itself the world's first atheist state in 1967, closing all churches and mosques and converting them to other uses. The Sigurimi, the secret police, was one of the most pervasive in the communist world, maintaining a climate of surveillance and control that permitted almost no deviation from the official line. Life in communist Albania was, by any external measure, extremely constrained and extremely poor, and yet Albanians lived their lives. They fell in love and raised families and kept alive, in private, the religious traditions that were officially prohibited, and told stories and made music and maintained the ancient code of hospitality, the kanun, that was as much a part of Albanian identity as any political system. The isolation that the regime imposed produced a society that was, in many ways, frozen in a particular moment, insulated from the changes happening elsewhere in Europe, developing its own internal logic, preserving things that were being lost elsewhere and losing things that were being preserved elsewhere. Yugoslavia under Tito presents the most interesting alternative case within the European communist world, the case of a communist state that broke with the Soviet Union in 1948 and developed its own, distinctly different version of socialist daily life. Tito's Yugoslavia was not a democracy. It was a one-party state with genuine political repression and a secret police, but it had features that distinguished it sharply from the Soviet model. Workers' self-management, introduced in the early 1950s, gave Yugoslav workers a degree of genuine decision-making power over their enterprises that was unprecedented in the communist world. The economy was more market-oriented than in the Soviet Union. Prices for some goods were set by supply and demand rather than by central plan. Most significantly for daily life, Yugoslavia was open in ways that other communist countries were not. Yugoslavs could travel to the West, and many did, going to work in West Germany or Austria, and sending remittances home. Foreign tourists could visit Yugoslavia freely. The Adriatic coast of what is now Croatia and Montenegro was developed as a major tourist destination, and the annual presence of Western European sunbathers on Yugoslav beaches made it one of the few places in the communist world where the contrast between East and West was a daily visual reality rather than an abstraction derived from forbidden radio broadcasts. The Yugoslavs could listen to Western music openly, wear Western fashions without stigma, consume Western cultural products with relative freedom. The system was still authoritarian, but its authoritarianism had a different texture, more relaxed in lifestyle matters, more tolerant of cultural experimentation, more willing to let the daily lives of its citizens be shaped by something other than the demands of party ideology. What did it mean to be a child in communist country? The question opens into something surprisingly warm and complicated. Children, after all, do not experience their political circumstances directly. They experience them as the background conditions of a childhood that contains all the universal elements of childhood: play, learning, friendship, imagination, the discovery of the self in relation to others. The political system was the weather, the landscape, present everywhere, determining things but rarely the explicit object of attention. A Soviet child of the 1960s or 70s would have grown up with certain things as simply part of the texture of existence. The Lenin portrait in every classroom, not frightening, just there, part of the institutional furniture, like the blackboard and the rows of desks. The pioneer salute, right arm raised, palm flat and slightly tilted, performed at the opening of each school day, a gesture that became automatic enough to lose its content, like the rote prayer of a nominally religious society. The wall newspapers that students made, sheets of paper covered with slogans and drawings and reports on the class's achievements, hung in the corridor, which were taken seriously by some and treated as a bore by others. The summer pioneer camp was genuinely anticipated by most children with something close to joy, because it meant summer, which meant freedom from school and the small apartment and the routines of urban life, and adventure, which meant swimming in the lake and sleeping in a bunk bed alongside your friends and learning to identify mushrooms in the forest and putting on a theatrical performance for the Parents' Day and staying up late talking in the dark after lights out. The political content, the songs about Lenin, the flag ceremonies, the political discussions, was there, woven into the summer, but it did not, for most children at most times, define the experience. The lake was the experience. The friends were the experience. The particular quality of a summer night under stars in the countryside after a day of physical activity was the experience. The children who grew up in the Stalinist period had a different, darker experience, one shaped by the terror that surrounded their parents' lives even if they did not fully understand it. The child who came home to find that a parent had been arrested, or who was told only that a parent had gone on a business trip and must not be asked about, entered a world of adult fear and managed silence that left its mark. Many children of the Stalinist era later described the experience of growing up with a secret, not knowing the truth of their family's circumstances, knowing only that there was something that could not be spoken, as one of the defining experiences of their lives. These secrets shaped how they learned to speak and what they learned to trust, and how they related to authority for the rest of their lives. The children of dissidents had a specific experience that illustrates the reach of the system into the most private family relationships. When a parent was arrested or lost a job for political reasons, the consequences rippled through the family immediately. The child might suddenly find that she was no longer welcome at the pioneer camp she had expected to attend. The university place that had seemed secure might suddenly become uncertain. The teacher who'd been friendly might become cool and distant. Children learned, from these experiences, that the political world was not separate from the personal world, that what happened in the realm of ideology could appear at the dinner table and change the texture of everything. And yet children also learned from the adults around them the art of survival, the art of navigating the system without being entirely consumed by it, of maintaining a private self behind the public performance, of finding joy in the spaces the system did not reach. The grandmother who told the old stories that the official history did not contain. The father who listened to foreign radio broadcasts with the volume turned very low, and occasionally, very carefully, shared what he had heard. The older sibling who somehow had access to foreign music, and who played it on a tape recorder in the evenings, the sounds of a different world filtering through the wall of the bedroom. These were the informal educations that prepared children for the complexity of the lives they would lead. The 1980s were, across the communist world, a decade of mounting crisis, economic, political, moral. The economies of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were, by objective measurement, falling further and further behind the economies of the West. The gap in living standards that had seemed, in the 1950s, like something that could be overcome through the superior productive capacity of the planned economy, had instead widened year by year. The Soviet consumer, in 1985, was materially worse off relative to her Western counterpart than she had been in 1965. The computers and the microchips and the information technology that were transforming the Western economies were barely present in the communist world. The military-industrial complex consumed a proportion of economic resources that left nothing for the consumer economy. The agriculture remained inefficient. The service sector was minimal. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985, was 44 years old, the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin, and genuinely different from his predecessors in his willingness to acknowledge the problems of the system. His program of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, was not intended to end communism. It was intended to save it by making it more honest and more efficient. What it actually did was to release forces that neither he nor anyone else could control. Forces that had been building for decades under the surface of the official world, and that, once released, proved unstoppable. Glasnost, the policy of greater openness in public discourse, had an immediate and dramatic effect on Soviet daily life. Newspapers that had been entirely predictable suddenly became interesting. Television programs began to address topics that had been off-limits. Stalin's crimes, the corruption of the nomenklatura, the failures of the economic system, the truth about the war in Afghanistan where Soviet soldiers were dying in a conflict that the official media had presented as a straightforward mission of international socialist solidarity. People began to talk more openly, to say in semi-public contexts things that had previously been reserved for the most trusted private conversations. The atmosphere of the country changed with a speed that was almost shocking. The effect of glasnost on the Soviet population was complex and not entirely comfortable. Some people welcomed it with unambiguous joy. They'd been waiting for this, had known that truth-telling was possible, had kept themselves ready for the moment when it would be permitted. Others found it disorienting. The official certainties that had structured their lives, that they had built their understanding of the world around, were suddenly being questioned, and the questioning produced not liberation, but anxiety. If everything they had been told was wrong or at least incomplete, then what could they trust? The world that opened up through glasnost was in some ways more frightening than the world it replaced, because the new world required you to form your own judgments rather than simply receiving the judgments of the party. In the satellite states of Eastern Europe, the reforms in the Soviet Union were read as a signal that the guarantee backing the communist regimes, the guarantee of Soviet military intervention to prevent systemic change, as in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, might no longer be operative. Gorbachev had made statements suggesting that the Soviet Union would not intervene to prop up failing communist regimes. The populations of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria, and Romania received these signals and began, with varying degrees of caution and boldness, to act on them. In Poland, where Solidarity had been operating underground since the imposition of martial law in 1981, negotiations between the government and the opposition led in 1989 to semi-free elections in which Solidarity was permitted to contest seats up to a fixed limit. The result was a landslide for Solidarity. The communist government received almost no support in the constituencies it had been required to contest. Within months, Poland had a non-communist government for the first time since 1944, led by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a Catholic intellectual close to solidarity and to the Church. The change that had seemed impossible was happening. In Hungary, the Reform Communist government began dismantling the border fence with Austria in May 1989, and thousands of East Germans who had obtained permission to visit Hungary took the opportunity to cross into the West, setting off a refugee crisis that the East German government was wholly unable to manage. In Leipzig, every Monday evening in the autumn of 1989, the Monday demonstrations grew from hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands. Citizens walking peacefully through the streets, carrying candles, demanding freedom of expression, freedom of travel, free elections. The security forces were massed and ready, but the order to shoot was never given. The demonstrations continued, and on the night of November 9th, the East German government announced in a confused and unprepared press conference that citizens could now travel freely to the West. The crowds that had been watching television rushed to the Berlin Wall, and the wall came down. The speed and completeness of the communist collapse in Eastern Europe, from the first Polish elections in June 1989 to the fall of the Romanian regime in December of the same year, was astonishing to virtually everyone who lived through it, including those who had most actively worked for change. The systems that had seemed permanent, that had been built and maintained over 4 decades at enormous human cost, dissolved in the space of months. The apparatus of surveillance and control, which had seemed so comprehensive and so overwhelming, turned out to have been held in place not primarily by force, but by the appearance of inevitability. And once that appearance was punctured, once it became clear that change was possible, the appearance dissolved and everything changed with it. The Soviet Union itself lasted 2 more years, until the failed coup of August 1991, when hardliners attempted to overthrow Gorbachev and preserve the system, and failed, and in failing destroyed the last authority of the party that the system had been built around. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, when 15 former Soviet republics became independent states, was experienced not with the celebration that had accompanied the fall of the wall in Berlin, but with something more mixed: relief, grief, uncertainty, the bewilderment of people whose country had simply ceased to exist. On the morning of December the 25th, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time and the Russian tricolour was raised in its place. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had not wished for this outcome, who had believed until the end that a reformed Soviet Union was possible, resigned the presidency of a country that no longer existed. In millions of homes across the former Soviet space, people watched this on their television sets. The small, not quite sharp screens, some now in colour, that had been the windows onto the official world for 40 years, and felt what they felt, which was different for everyone, and which no single account can capture. The education of a child under communist rule was not just a matter of what happened in the classroom. It was also a matter of the relationship between the school and the home, and specifically the ways in which the school's version of the world might conflict with the home's version, and how families navigated that potential conflict. This was one of the most delicate and revealing aspects of daily life under communist rule, the management of the gap between official and private knowledge within the family itself. Most parents in communist countries did not systematically counter the official narrative with an alternative one. The risks were too great. A child who repeated a private conversation in the wrong context could cause serious harm to the family. So instead, parents taught a more subtle lesson, the lesson of careful speech, of the difference between public and private discourse, of the context in which different things could be said. At school you say X, but at home we know Y. This was not hypocrisy, but practical wisdom, the transmission of a survival skill that every generation had to learn freshly within its own circumstances. Some parents went further and tried to give their children access to the fuller picture, to the history that the textbooks omitted, to the countries that official maps diminished, to the literature that the censorship had suppressed. These were acts of genuine moral courage, because the consequences of discovery could be severe. The family that kept forbidden books, samizdat literature, religious texts, foreign publications, behind a false wall in the bookcase, or wrapped in the covers of officially approved volumes, was making a choice about what was worth risking for the sake of truth. The intergenerational transmission of memory was particularly important in those countries and communities where the communist system had attempted to erase or rewrite specific historical events. In Ukraine, where the Holodomor had killed millions and had been deliberately suppressed in official history for decades, the memory survived in families, in the stories grandmothers told about years of hunger that the history books did not mention, in the landscape of villages that still bore the marks of the depopulation, in the silence that fell in certain conversations when certain subjects were approached. This private, family-held memory was not the same as public historical knowledge, but it was real, and it preserved something that the official record had tried to destroy. The role of humour in managing the psychological burden of communist daily life cannot be overstated. The joke, the anecdote, the wisecrack, the satirical observation, was one of the primary cultural forms through which people maintained their sanity and their sense of themselves as rational beings in an irrational system. The humour was dark, often brilliantly so, and it circulated with remarkable speed through the informal networks of daily life, appearing simultaneously in Moscow and Warsaw and Prague in slightly different forms, adapted to local conditions but sharing the same essential structure. The structure of the classic communist political joke was almost always the same. The gap between the official claim and the lived reality, the absurdity of the system's logic extended to its conclusion, the moment of recognition when the joke confirmed what everyone privately knew. A man goes to the doctor and says, "I think I'm a dog." The doctor says, "How long have you had this problem?" The man says, "Since I was a puppy." The versions that were explicitly political followed the same pattern but pointed at the system. The Trabant joke. Why do they make Trabants with a heated rear window? Pause. To warm your hands when you push it. The Soviet service joke. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. The humour was not just entertainment. It was a form of social bonding, a way of establishing trust, because to tell a political joke was to expose yourself, to trust that the person you were telling it to would not report it. It was therefore a litmus test, a way of establishing who could be trusted in a world where trust was scarce and valuable. The moment when you told a joke to someone you were not sure about and watched their reaction, the slight freeze of uncertainty, the glance around the room, or conversely the immediate burst of laughter, the leaning in, the response that told you were among your own, was one of the small but significant navigation points of daily life. The physical landscape of communist cities deserves more attention than it often receives, because the built environment is one of the most enduring legacies of communist rule and one of the most immediate expressions of its values and its contradictions. Communist architecture was not monolithic. It ranged from the Stalinist grandiosity of the Moscow skyscrapers and the Warsaw Palace of Culture to the radical functionalism of the Khrushchevka apartment buildings to the more adventurous experiments of East German and Czechoslovak architecture in the 60s and 70s. The Stalin-era buildings, the 7 great skyscrapers of Moscow, the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, similar structures in Kiev, Riga, Prague, and other cities, were extraordinary objects, massive and ornate, combining elements of Gothic verticality with socialist realism's demand for heroic optimism. They dominated their city centres with an authority that was clearly intentional. They were expressions of state power, material arguments for the grandeur and permanence of the socialist project. Standing at the base of one of these buildings was a physical experience of scale that made the individual feel small in a way that was itself a kind of ideological statement. The Khrushchevka apartment buildings that followed in the late 1950s and 60s were everything the Stalin buildings were not. Small, cheap, fast to build, designed for functional adequacy rather than monumental effect. Named sardonically after Nikita Khrushchev, who launched the building program, they were produced from prefabricated concrete panels assembled on site in a process that could be completed astonishingly quickly. The apartments inside were small but self-contained, a revolution for many of the families who moved into them after years of communal apartment living. Having a kitchen of your own, a bathroom of your own, a front door that you alone controlled, these things were not nothing. They were a real improvement in the conditions of daily life, even if the apartment was very small and the building was ugly and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbours' conversations. The city as a whole, in a communist country, had a particular visual character that those who grew up in it remember with great specificity, and those who visited from the West found arresting. The absence of commercial advertising was perhaps the most immediately striking feature. The streets were not covered in the visual noise of competing products and competing messages. The skyline was not broken by illuminated signs and billboards. Instead, there were slogans, political slogans, production targets, celebrations of the party and its achievements, portraits of Lenin and sometimes of the current leadership. These were constant visual presences, so constant that they became part of the background, noticed by the foreign visitor and unremarked by the resident. The absence of colour was another persistent impression. The grey of the concrete buildings, the grey of the winter sky, the grey of the pavements, the grey-brown of the fur hats, and the grey-green of the military coats. The visual palette of the communist city in winter was genuinely restricted. People wore what was available, which was typically limited in colour as in everything else. And yet within this restricted palette, individuals found ways to assert themselves. A bright headscarf, a particular way of tying a coat, shoes that were just slightly more interesting than the standard issue. The search for personal style within the constraints of what was available was a constant, quiet, creative exercise. The concept of deficit in Russian, was one of the organizing principles of Soviet consumer culture, and it is worth dwelling on because it shaped not just shopping behavior, but a whole psychology of abundance and scarcity. Deficit referred to any good that was officially available, that is, produced within the socialist system, but in practice unavailable in sufficient quantity to meet demand. Almost everything desirable was, at various times and to various degrees, in deficit. The consequence was a particular relationship to goods, not the casual relationship of the consumer who assumes that more can always be obtained, but the careful, almost reverent relationship of the person who knows that what she has may be difficult or impossible to replace. Objects were repaired rather than replaced. Shoes were resoled at the cobbler's workshop until the uppers were beyond saving. Appliances were maintained and repaired by people who developed extraordinary skills with limited tools. Clothes were altered and remade. The culture of repair and reuse that communist shortages enforced was, from an environmental standpoint, genuinely more sustainable than the disposable consumer culture of the West, though this sustainability was entirely involuntary and would have been abandoned in an instant for the abundance that the West offered. But it produced, alongside its frustrations, real skills and real ingenuity, a craft tradition of making do that was passed down through families and communities. The pharmacist at the neighborhood pharmacy, the apteker, occupied a social position somewhat similar to that of the neighborhood doctor, a dispenser of scarce goods who had the power to help or to decline to help, whose goodwill was worth cultivating. The apteker was the site of many small negotiations about the availability of medicines that were in theory stocked, but in practice often absent. A prescription for a specific medication might send a patient to several different apteki before the medication was found, or might result in the patient being advised to try again next week, with no guarantee that next week would be different. The informal economy of medicine, obtaining drugs through black market channels, trading drugs with neighbors who had different prescriptions, using veterinary medications in lieu of unobtainable human equivalents, was one of the more grimly practical aspects of communist daily life. The relationship with time was different under communist rule than in a market economy, and this is something that those who have not experienced it find difficult to fully grasp. In a market economy, time is money, literally, and the cultural values around time reflect this. Efficiency, punctuality, the maximization of productive use of the hours, these are the virtues of the market economy, and they shape the culture profoundly. In a communist economy, where your wage was set regardless of your productivity, where there was no direct relationship between the quality of your work and your material reward, and where the hours spent in queues were simply a cost of daily existence that could not be avoided, the relationship with time was different. Time was not scarce in the same way. There was plenty of it, much of it spent waiting. And in the waiting, people developed a different relationship with the present, more tolerant of its unhurriedness, more practiced in the arts of simply being in a moment without insisting that the moment be productive. There is a quality of Soviet daily life that its chroniclers often note, a quality of human presence, of the attention people gave each other, that stands in contrast to the atomized busyness of market societies. When you spend an hour in a queue, you talk to the person next to you, or you observe them, or you are observed. When there is no smartphone to retreat into, no inbox to check, no stream of digital distraction available, you are present in your immediate physical environment in a way that we have largely ceased to be. The Soviet grandmother sitting on a bench in the courtyard of the apartment building, watching the children play, talking to the neighbor who comes to sit beside her, was connected to her immediate social world in a way that her Western counterpart, sitting inside watching television, perhaps was not. This is not to romanticize the poverty and restriction that produced this quality of presence, but it is to note that loss and gain are often mixed together in ways that resist simple accounting. The legacy of communist daily life, the psychological, cultural and social legacy, continues to be worked through in the countries that experienced it, decades after the political systems themselves have been dismantled. The research of post-communist psychologists and sociologists has identified a cluster of attitudes and behaviors that appear with greater frequency in populations that lived under communist rule than in those that did not. A lower baseline of social trust, particularly trust in institutions and strangers, a stronger preference for certainty and security over risk and opportunity, a more complex relationship with authority, simultaneously more cynical about it and more dependent on it, a tendency toward what has been called learned helplessness in situations where individual initiative is possible, but the habit of relying on systemic structures persists. These are generalizations, and generalizations always distort the reality they describe. Individuals vary enormously, and the variation within any post-communist society is greater than the variation between it and its neighbors. But the patterns are real enough to be documented and to matter, real enough to shape the politics of the post-communist countries in ways that continue to surprise and sometimes frustrate those who expected the transition to market democracy to be smooth and complete. The habits of mind formed over decades under a particular system do not dissolve when the system ends. They persist, adapted and modified by new circumstances, carrying within them the memory of the world they were formed in. What we carry from tonight's journey into the world of communist daily life is perhaps not so different from what the people who lived it carried: an awareness of complexity, a resistance to simple accounts, a respect for the full human texture of lives lived within constraint. We have walked through those lives tentatively, as visitors who know they cannot fully understand but who are trying to understand something. We have tried to hear the voices, not the voices of the great historical figures, though they matter too, but the voices of the woman who stands in the queue and thinks about dinner, the man who plays chess in the stairwell, the child who presses her foot against her brother's foot under the table and holds back laughter, the grandmother who keeps the geraniums red on the windowsill. These are the voices that history most easily loses, the lives that history most easily reduces to statistics or background conditions, and yet they are, in a very real sense, the most important voices, because they are the voices of the experience as it was actually lived, in its full particularity and warmth and difficulty and resilience. They are the voices of the 48 windows. They are the voices we've been listening to all this long and quiet night, and so we carry with us from this long night's journey through the world of communist daily life, not a simple moral but a more complex understanding of what people can endure and what they will not give up even under the most extreme pressure, and what the quiet, ordinary heroism of simply maintaining one's humanity in difficult circumstances looks like. It looks like 48 windows. It looks like geraniums on a sill. It looks like chess in a stairwell, and kitchen table conversations, and the book lent between friends, and the joke whispered in a moment of shared clarity, and the grandmother who teaches her grandchild to pray by heart in the dark. The night has grown deep now. The city outside is quiet in the way that cities only become quiet very late, when even the last stragglers have gone home, and the traffic has settled to its minimum, and the only sounds are the occasional distant sound of the world continuing its business without urgency. In the apartment building with its 48 identical windows, the lights are all dark now. The people inside are sleeping. We have walked a long way tonight. We have walked through the factories and the collective farms, through the bread lines and the black markets, through the political meetings and the pioneer summer camps, through the gulag and the dachas, through the Prague spring and the Polish winter, through the Cultural Revolution and the Cuban literacy campaign, through the kitchens and the stairwells and the small intimate spaces where people were most fully themselves. We have tried to see the full range of the experience, its cruelties and its genuine achievements, its oppressiveness and its unexpected warmths, its great public dramas and its daily private negotiations. What we have found, above everything else, is people. People whose circumstances were very different from our own, but whose fundamental nature was not different at all. People who wanted enough to eat and somewhere warm to sleep and work that meant something, and the company of those they loved, and the freedom to think their own thoughts in the privacy of their own minds. People who were capable of great courage, the courage of the dissidents who spoke when speaking was dangerous, the courage of the workers who went on strike knowing the risks, and of the smaller, quieter courage of simply going on, of maintaining kindness and dignity and humour in conditions designed to erode all three. History has a way of making the past feel inevitable, as if the way things turned out was the only way they could have turned out, as if the suffering was somehow necessary, as if the story had to go the way it went. But the people who lived through communist rule were not living inside an inevitable story. They were living inside an open story, a story whose ending they did not know, a story that could, at any moment, have gone differently. The woman standing in the bread line in Moscow in 1937 did not know that there were still 54 years of Soviet rule ahead of her. She was simply standing in a queue, in a coat that was not quite warm enough, thinking about what she would cook for dinner and whether her husband would be home before dark. There is a particular gift that history can give us if we let it. Not the gift of answers, history rarely provides those, but the gift of perspective, of a kind of deep context that makes our own moment more legible and our own choices more meaningful. When we understand what it costs to maintain a free press and an independent judiciary, and the right to vote and the right to speak and the right to leave, when we understand these things not as abstract principles, but as things that were absent from the lives of hundreds of millions of people over many decades, with consequences that we have spent this night exploring, then perhaps we hold them a little more carefully. Perhaps we understand a little better why they matter. Perhaps we're a little less inclined to take them for granted. The communist experiment ended in most of the places where it took hold without the revolution that it had been expecting. It did not end in a great uprising of the workers. It ended with the slow, grinding accumulation of exhaustion, the exhaustion of populations that had been performing loyalty for 40 years and had finally run out of the energy required for performance, the exhaustion of economies that could not produce what their people needed, the exhaustion of party functionaries who no longer believed what they were saying and had lost the conviction required to enforce it. And in that exhaustion, something remarkable happened. The wall that had seemed permanent came down, the regimes that had seemed eternal dissolved. The story moved to its next chapter. The people who lived through it were changed by it in ways that time alone is slowly uncovering, ways that show up in the politics and the psychology and the family structures of post-communist societies decades after the flags have come down. The marks left by decades of communist daily life do not simply vanish when the system ends. They persist in habits of mind and social trust, and the particular ways that people who grew up in that world navigate the uncertainties of freedom. But the geraniums persist too. The chess games in the stairwells, the kitchen conversations, the books lent between friends, the grandmothers teaching prayers in the dark, the children pressing feet together under the table. All of this persists, not in those specific forms perhaps, but in the deeper forms of human connection and resilience, and the refusal to be entirely defined by the world that surrounds you. The 48 identical windows contained 48 irreducibly individual lives. That is the thing that no system, however totalizing in its ambitions, has ever managed to change. The apartment building is still standing, somewhere in a city that has changed its streets and perhaps its name. The concrete is still the colour of winter sky. The stairwell still smells of something sweet and indefinable. And if you stand outside it on a quiet night and look up at the dark windows, You can almost feel the weight of all those lives, all those Tuesdays and Saturdays and early mornings and long evenings and small moments of joy and grief, and the ordinary, beautiful, stubborn, undimmed persistence of being human. You can almost hear the alarm clock set for 5:30. You can almost smell the buckwheat porridge beginning to cook in the kitchen. You can almost see the geraniums, impossibly red against the pale concrete and the grey morning sky. The world they lived in is gone, or mostly gone. The world we live in is different, imperfect in its own ways, facing its own challenges and carrying its own contradictions. But we carry them with us, those millions of quiet lives, those accumulated Tuesday afternoons, those conversations at kitchen tables in small apartments, where the walls may or may not have had ears, but the people inside were, always and irreducibly themselves. We carry them with us, and they are part of us now, part of the great long story of what it has meant, across all the centuries and all the experiments and all the attempts to make the world better, or simply to survive it, to be a human being on this earth, making the best of whatever morning finds you, in whatever apartment, under whatever sky.